The courtroom was tense. You could feel the heat of the moment as the air seemed to hum with anticipation. People shuffled in their seats, eyes darting toward the judge's bench where the stern figure of Judge William Hart presided over the room. His reputation preceded him. A tough, no-nonsense man with decades of experience, Judge Hart was known for his razor-sharp rulings and ruthless efficiency. He had built a career out of intimidating defendants and lawyers alike, keeping the law straight and narrow. No one ever dared to question him. But today was different. The door at the back of the courtroom swung open, and there he was, stepping in with a quiet but undeniable presence. Clint Eastwood. Whispers rippled through the courtroom like a wave crashing against the shore. What was Clint Eastwood doing here? He had been out of the public eye for years, his acting career long behind him. The Hollywood legend had transitioned to the world of law a few years ago, but it was still a mystery to most whether he was any good. The idea of him standing in a courtroom as a practicing lawyer seemed almost laughable. After all, he wasn't exactly a spring chicken anymore. Judge Hart didn't miss a beat. His eyes narrowed as he looked down at the man who was about to shake up his courtroom. Well, the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Clint Eastwood, the famous actor turned lawyer. You do realize this is a court of law, not some movie set, don't you? The audience tensed, some holding their breath. Others chuckled nervously. But Clint didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, his jaw set, as though he had heard this type of mockery 1,000 times before. He took a slow, deliberate step forward and introduced himself, his voice calm but firm. I'm here to represent Mr. David Taylor, Clint said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. David Taylor was a young man in his early 20s, sitting nervously at the defendant's table, facing a charge of armed robbery. The evidence seemed damning, and with such a high-profile case, no one could have expected Clint to take it on. Yet here he was. Judge Hart didn't hide his amusement. He smirked as he adjusted his glasses, peering down at Clint with a hint of mockery in his eyes. Represent him, huh? Well, let's see what you've got, Mr. Eastwood, Judge Hart said, clearly trying to provoke him. You might have had a nice career playing tough guys on screen, but this is real life, not some action movie. I doubt your old-school charm is going to cut it here. The tension in the room escalated. Everyone was waiting for Clint's response. Would he back down? Would he let the judge get under his skin? Clint's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady and unwavering. I've dealt with worse, Clint said. A courtroom is just another kind of battlefield, and I've never backed down from a fight. Judge Hart didn't respond immediately. Instead, he raised his eyebrows, impressed by Clint's confidence, though he wouldn't show it. Let's see if your words match your actions, the judge said, gesturing to the prosecutor to begin. As Clint made his way to the defense table, a sense of disbelief spread through the room. Here was Clint Eastwood, the man who had once stared down villains in westerns and action films, now sitting across from a seasoned prosecutor in a high-stakes trial. Would his years of experience as an actor translate to his legal career? Could the tough guy image he had built up over the years really be enough to win a case in the courtroom? The crowd settled into an uneasy silence as the prosecutor, a slick, well-dressed man named Gregory Hayes, stood up to make his case. Hayes was known for his cutthroat approach to law, never backing down from a challenge. He wasted no time in launching into his opening statements, painting Taylor as nothing more than a cold-blooded criminal. He was caught red-handed, Hayes said, his voice booming. Witnesses saw him with the weapon. Surveillance footage shows him entering the store, brandishing the gun. And the victim was traumatized by the whole ordeal. This man is guilty, and we will prove it. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The evidence seemed airtight, and Hayes' argument was compelling. The defense had its work cut out for it. Clint didn't move from his chair, his face a mask of calm as he listened intently. The weight of the moment didn't seem to faze him. The judge looked at him, clearly amused by his lack of reaction, and gestured for Clint to begin. Your Honor, members of the jury, Clint began, his voice low and steady, we are not here to deny that my client was present at the scene of the crime. But what we are here to do is to uncover the truth. Clint paused, his gaze sweeping the room, locking eyes with the jury one by one. He had that same commanding presence he'd had on screen, the one that made people believe in his character, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," Clint continued. "I'm asking you to keep an open mind. We've all heard one side of the story. Now it's time to hear the other." Clint's words hung in the air, the courtroom eerily quiet. He had just made the first move, and though it was subtle, it was enough to remind everyone that Clint Eastwood was no stranger to the art of persuasion. Judge Hart, who had been smiling a moment ago, was now paying closer attention. His smirk had faded, replaced by a subtle wariness. Maybe, just maybe, Clint Eastwood had something more up his sleeve than anyone had realized. The judge adjusted his glasses, giving Clint a brief, sharp look before turning his attention to the prosecutor. "You may proceed, Mr. Hayes," Judge Hart said, his voice less certain than before. As the trial continued, it became clear that Clint Eastwood wasn't going to be intimidated by the judge, the prosecutor, or anyone in that courtroom. He was in it to win it, and this battle was just beginning. But one thing was certain. Clint Eastwood had just made his entrance, and this courtroom would never be the same. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood wasn't just a Hollywood legend. He had become a symbol of resilience, grit, and an unwavering sense of justice. To understand the man sitting in that courtroom, one needed to go back in time. To understand the depth of his actions, one needed to see the scars he had gathered, not from bullets and brawls, but from the battles that took place within his own heart. Born in 1930 in San Francisco, Clint was raised in a working-class family. His early years were marked by a sense of isolation. His parents, a deeply religious couple, were often at odds, and Clint learned early on how to navigate tension and discomfort. He didn't have the luxury of an ideal upbringing. There was no glamorous childhood, no easy road to success. Instead, Clint's path was shaped by hardship. He had a rebellious streak, one that often clashed with the rules and expectations around him. He didn't thrive in school, feeling out of place in a rigid system. But he had a raw, natural talent for the outdoors, for working with his hands, and, perhaps most notably, for reading people. He didn't know it then, but these skills would serve him in ways that no formal education could have prepared him for. His first real break came during the 1950s when he was cast as Rowdy Yates in the television series Rawhide. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Clint wasn't just playing a cowboy. He was becoming one. The role, which he reluctantly accepted at first, would shape the rest of his life. He lived and breathed the Western lifestyle. An honest man, facing moral dilemmas, and constantly trying to do what was right in a world that didn't always follow those rules. What Clint didn't know then was how much of that would mirror his own journey. The characters he portrayed became a mirror of his internal struggles. The persona of the tough, stoic man who never backed down from a fight or a challenge was one Clint slowly crafted in himself. But life wasn't always that simple, and the complexities of Clint's personal life soon began to surface. In the 1970s, Clint had already become a star. His portrayal of the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy turned him into a worldwide sensation. But beneath the surface of fame, Clint struggled with a sense of emptiness. The adoration of fans and the accolades were often at odds with the internal conflict he felt. He sought solace in different places, divorcing twice and grappling with his role as a father to several children from different relationships. The death of his good friend and fellow actor, George Kennedy, hit him harder than he had anticipated. It was a wake-up call. For years, Clint had lived his life on autopilot, driven by external forces, but George's passing forced him to reevaluate his life. What was he really doing? Was fame and fortune enough? Or was there something more he needed to give? By the late 1980s, Clint had decided to pursue a different path. While many actors in Hollywood found themselves relegated to secondary roles or fading into obscurity, Clint pivoted. He directed. He produced. He found a new calling behind the camera, earning accolades for his work in films like Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby, and Gran Torino. It was clear to everyone that Clint had evolved. No longer just the tough cowboy, Clint had become a master storyteller, using his own life experience to guide him through deeper, more emotionally charged films. But something was still missing. It was clear that the man who had spent years on screen saving the day, overcoming challenges, and confronting his fears was now at a crossroads. Clint didn't just want to entertain. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to leave a legacy beyond his cinematic achievements. It was then that he decided to step away from the limelight, trading the silver screen for something far more personal: law. Clint had always been fascinated by the intricacies of justice, fairness, and the way the system worked. His involvement in legal matters had been sparked by his own experiences, from the injustices he had seen throughout his life to the real-world lessons that film had taught him. In his quieter years, Clint began taking law courses in his free time. It wasn't easy. He was no longer the young man who could memorize lines or command the attention of a crowd with his mere presence. He was older, with a lifetime of experience but far less formal education than most lawyers. But Clint had never been one to shy away from a challenge. After years of studying the law, he passed the bar exam. He wasn't just Clint Eastwood the actor anymore. He was Clint Eastwood, ESQ. The move shocked many of his peers. Some scoffed at the idea of a Hollywood icon trying to make it as a lawyer. Others admired his perseverance, but few took him seriously. What did Clint Eastwood know about law? He wasn't some Harvard graduate or a hotshot attorney from a prestigious firm. He was just the man who had once looked down the barrel of a gun on screen and played the part of a hero. But Clint knew something that many didn't. He knew people. He understood the human condition, what drove people to make the choices they did. And most importantly, he understood that the law wasn't always about technicalities. It was about fairness, about truth, and about fighting for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. When Clint decided to take on the case of David Taylor, the young man accused of armed robbery, it wasn't just about legal strategy. It was personal. Clint saw something in Taylor, a desperation, a hunger for redemption. It reminded him of his younger self. And just like he had faced his own battles over the years, Clint was ready to face whatever challenges this courtroom would throw his way. But this time, he wasn't just battling against crime. He was battling against an entire system that had already made up its mind, led by a judge who was quick to mock him for his past. Clint wasn't going to let that stand. As Clint sat at the defense table, his mind flashed back to the struggles that had brought him here. He had been in countless battles, but none like this. This was more than just a case. This was his chance to prove that even an aging, washed-up actor could make a difference. He wasn't just fighting for David Taylor anymore. He was fighting for himself, for respect, and for the opportunity to leave a mark on the world that no one could dismiss. Clint knew that the courtroom was about to become his next battlefield. The courtroom felt charged with an energy that was difficult to describe, almost as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Clint Eastwood had made his entrance, and though the judge and prosecutor had ridiculed him at first, there was an undeniable shift in the room. It wasn't just that Clint was a celebrity. It was something deeper, a presence that demanded attention and respect. Clint was no stranger to tension. His entire life, from his childhood to his Hollywood years, had been filled with conflict, both internal and external. But this was a new kind of battlefield. Judge William Hart sat firmly behind his bench, his fingers drumming rhythmically as he glanced over at Clint, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. It was clear the judge wasn't going to let Clint's unexpected arrival go without some form of punishment, whether through subtle comments or more serious legal tactics. As the trial unfolded, the rising conflict became impossible to ignore. The tension between Clint and the judge was palpable. Every time Clint made a move, Hart was ready to challenge him. It was a battle of wits, each trying to outmaneuver the other, both determined to prove their authority in the courtroom. The prosecutor, Gregory Hayes, wasn't one to shy away from a fight either. Hayes had a reputation for being ruthless, especially when it came to high-profile cases. His sharp suit, perfectly combed hair, and piercing gaze screamed confidence, even arrogance. But Clint, despite his age, didn't flinch. Every word that Hayes threw at him, Clint absorbed with calm, his eyes never wavering. And when Clint spoke, it was as if the room had no choice but to listen. Today, the trial was entering its third day, and the tension was growing. Clint had already made several key objections, each one calculated, each one pushing back against the system that seemed determined to crush his client, David Taylor. But Judge Hart wasn't taking it kindly. He was quick to rule against Clint, constantly reminding him of the rules of the courtroom with thinly veiled sarcasm. "You might have saved the day in a Western, Mr. Eastwood," the judge sneered during one particularly heated exchange. "But here, in my courtroom, you'll need more than a cowboy's charm to make a difference." The room held its breath as Clint stood up, his expression unchanging. He was used to this kind of mockery. He'd faced worse in his acting career, where critics often judged him for playing the same tough guy roles over and over. But Clint didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that the only opinion that mattered was his own. "I didn't come here to impress you, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice low but strong, sending a ripple of silence through the room. "I came here to do what's right." Judge Hart's lips curled into a disdainful smile, and he motioned for Clint to sit back down. He wasn't ready to acknowledge that Clint might have a point. Not yet. Despite the friction between Clint and Judge Hart, there was one undeniable truth. Clint's arguments were beginning to make an impact. Each time he took the floor, he carefully picked apart the prosecution's case. He wasn't looking to win at any cost. He was looking to expose the truth, the layers of doubt that the prosecution had conveniently ignored. The facts didn't always line up, and Clint was ready to reveal the inconsistencies. But Hayes wasn't going to back down. He was too focused on winning at all costs. He had already made it clear that he believed David Taylor was guilty, and he wasn't about to let some Hollywood actor-turned-lawyer derail his efforts. On this particular day, the conflict reached a boiling point when Hayes made a bold move, presenting new evidence. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station that seemed to show David Taylor walking toward the scene of the robbery just minutes before it took place. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to make the jury sit up and take notice. Clint didn't flinch, but inside, he felt a pang of doubt. This footage was potentially damaging. The last thing he wanted was to lose David's case on a technicality. But he knew this was just another moment for him to prove that the truth wasn't always as clear as it appeared. Standing up, Clint cleared his throat and addressed the court with an air of calm authority. "Your Honor," Clint began, "I'm not disputing that David was near the scene, but proximity is not guilt. We need to ask ourselves, why did the victim fail to identify Mr. Taylor? Why were the weapon and the stolen goods never found in his possession?" There was a pause as Clint's words sank in. It wasn't a grand speech, but it was enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors. Judge Hart wasn't convinced, but he couldn't deny that Clint had made a valid point. Clint's voice grew even more forceful. "If we are to convict someone based solely on circumstantial evidence, then we do a disservice to the law. We must be certain, beyond any reasonable doubt. My client deserves that." The jury was listening. Some were nodding subtly, others looked to one another with questioning glances. It was clear that Clint had started to shift the dynamic in the room. The rising conflict wasn't just between Clint and the judge. It was between what was easy and what was just, between what was convenient and what was true. But as Clint continued, Hayes stood up, ready to strike back. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is speculating. We have evidence, and that evidence clearly points to Mr. Taylor's involvement." Judge Hart, despite his earlier scorn, couldn't ignore the weight of Clint's words. He cleared his throat and looked over at the jury. "We'll take a brief recess," Judge Hart announced, "but I expect the defense to remain on point and refrain from wild conjecture." The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone rose to take a break. Clint remained seated, his thoughts swirling. This was more than just a trial. It was a war of wills. He wasn't going to let the judge's contempt or the prosecutor's stubbornness deter him. The stakes were too high. David Taylor, who had been silently watching the trial unfold, looked over at Clint. The young man's eyes were filled with fear and hope, a mixture of desperation and belief. Clint knew that David was relying on him, and despite the odds, Clint was determined to give him more than just a defense. He was giving him a chance at redemption. As Clint made his way out of the courtroom for the break, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. This wasn't just about proving a point to Judge Hart or winning against Hayes. It was about confronting the system that often made decisions based on appearances and assumptions. Clint wasn't going to let that stand. Not now, not ever. He was in this fight for the long haul, and with every passing moment, the conflict between him and those who underestimated him grew even stronger. But Clint wasn't backing down. The rising conflict wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a battle for justice, and Clint was ready to see it through to the end. The recess had ended, and the tension in the courtroom felt heavier than ever. Clint Eastwood was no stranger to moments of pressure, but this was different. This wasn't a film set, where a director yelled cut, and everyone could breathe easy. This was real, and the stakes were higher than anything Clint had ever faced. As the trial resumed, Clint could feel the weight of the eyes in the room upon him. The jury, the judge, even the spectators. Everyone was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. And Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent decades in front of cameras and on sets, was no longer playing a role. This wasn't a character with a script to follow. This was his own life, his own choices, and it was time for him to put his full belief in the system he had come to respect. Judge Hart's eyes flicked from Clint to the jury, and his gavel struck with a finality that echoed in the room. The next stage of the trial had begun. "Mr. Eastwood, you may continue," the judge's voice boomed, his words dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see what wisdom you have to offer this court." Clint didn't flinch. He stood up, straightening his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. He wasn't about to let the judge's condescension get to him. He had a job to do. "Thank you, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice calm yet firm. "I'll keep it simple. I'm not here to dazzle anyone with rhetoric. I'm here to show you the truth." Clint's eyes moved toward the jury as he spoke, his gaze steady, his words cutting through the room like a knife. "We've been shown footage that claims to identify my client as a suspect, but I ask you this. Does proximity alone make someone guilty? Should we condemn a man based on circumstantial evidence when the truth is still uncertain?" Clint wasn't merely defending David Taylor. He was challenging the very foundation of the case against him. As the words left Clint's lips, there was a subtle shift in the room's energy. The jury was listening, and they were starting to question what they had initially been told. This wasn't about proving his innocence with grandiose speeches or flashy tricks. This was about breaking down the case and finding the cracks in the narrative the prosecution had built. As Clint continued, the prosecution countered, trying to chip away at his defense, making a concerted effort to discredit him. But Clint stood his ground. Every objection was met with a sharp, unwavering response. His strategy was clear. Show the jury that the prosecution was building its case on shaky ground, using flimsy evidence that couldn't stand up to scrutiny. The real turning point came when Clint called a surprise witness, an eyewitness who had been overlooked by both the prosecution and the defense. The man was an elderly gentleman named Samuel, who lived near the scene of the robbery and had seen someone else at the gas station that night. He didn't know who it was, but his testimony contradicted the prosecution's timeline. Clint's eyes locked on the witness as he took the stand. Samuel was older, his hands shaking slightly as he was sworn in, but his voice was steady as he described what he had seen. "I saw a man, all right," Samuel said, his voice clear and loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "But it wasn't David Taylor. It was someone else. The man was wearing a jacket, looked nervous, and was walking away from the scene right after the robbery took place. I'm sure of it. My memory's good, despite my age." The courtroom was silent. The jury leaned forward, hanging on every word. Even Judge Hart seemed to be reconsidering his previous judgments. Clint's eyes never left the witness as he spoke. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The tides were beginning to shift, and the weight of the prosecution's case was starting to unravel before them. But just as Clint thought he had made his breakthrough, Hayes objected. "Objection, Your Honor. This is unreliable testimony from an elderly man who clearly doesn't remember the events as they happened," Hayes argued, standing from his seat. "His word should not be trusted, and this testimony is irrelevant." Clint was already up and ready for the counterattack. "Your Honor, the witness has no reason to lie. He's providing the truth as he remembers it. This is not some flimsy attempt to distract from the facts, but evidence of reasonable doubt." Judge Hart hesitated for a moment, his gavel hovering in the air. It was clear that he didn't want to let this testimony stand. But the room was electric with the tension of the moment. Clint's calm demeanor was unshaken, and as the judge's gavel came down, a subtle murmur of approval swept through the jury. Overruled, Judge Hart declared, his tone grudging but final. The witness's testimony will stand. But let's remember, Mr. Eastwood, that this does not prove your client's innocence. Clint nodded, acknowledging the judge's ruling but silently reminding himself that this wasn't over yet. The real battle was yet to come. As the trial continued, Clint's mastery in the courtroom became more evident. His legal strategy wasn't about overpowering the opposition with aggression or force. It was about peeling back the layers of doubt and allowing the truth to shine through. The deeper the trial went, the more Clint's confidence grew. It was clear now that this was no longer about him proving his worth. It was about David Taylor and giving him a shot at redemption. But Clint wasn't just teaching the jury about justice. He was learning something, too. He was learning that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in the face of a villain or an enemy. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought within, when you have to reconcile your own past with the world around you. This trial, more than any movie or role, was forcing Clint to confront the person he had become and the man he still hoped to be. As Clint left the courtroom for the night, he took a deep breath. The case was far from over, and there would be many more challenges to face. But he knew one thing for sure. He was in it for the long haul. His journey was no longer just about defending David Taylor. It was about facing the truth, both in the courtroom and within himself. And Clint Eastwood, the man who had fought countless battles on screen, was now ready to face the most important one of all. The courtroom was quiet as the witness finished his testimony. The energy had shifted dramatically, and the truth was starting to seep through the cracks. Clint Eastwood had done what he did best. He had exposed doubt, challenged the assumptions, and forced the jury to rethink everything they had believed up until that point. But even Clint knew that this was only the beginning of the emotional journey that was about to unfold. The air was thick with anticipation, and every eye in the courtroom was on Clint as he sat down. He could feel the weight of the moment. He had turned the tide, but there was still so much left to prove. The stakes were higher than ever now, and as the days dragged on, Clint could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. This was about justice. Clint's mind began to race. The evidence was now in question, but there was still one thing that hadn't been addressed: David Taylor's state of mind. What was he really thinking when he was accused of the crime? Was he guilty, or had he been manipulated into a situation he didn't understand? Clint had spent days getting to know David, seeing the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty in his voice. It was clear that David was terrified, and Clint couldn't help but sympathize. There was no way this young man was capable of carrying out such a brutal robbery, not with the heart that Clint had witnessed in the few hours they'd spent together. But the evidence was damning. It wasn't enough to simply cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Clint needed something more, a breakthrough. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was late on the 5th day of the trial when Clint asked for a private moment with David in the holding room. They had barely spoken since the trial began, but Clint had sensed something was off. David had been quiet, withdrawn, the kind of quiet that spoke volumes. "David," Clint said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to tell me the truth, not just for the case, but for you. What happened that night?" David's eyes flickered with fear. His face was pale, and he was shaking slightly as he sat across from Clint. For a moment, it felt as though Clint was staring into the soul of the young man, someone who had been through so much and had yet to find a way out. "I didn't do it," David whispered, his voice barely audible. Clint leaned forward, the gravity of the moment settling over him. "I believe you, but you have to be honest with me. You have to tell me everything. If there's something you're holding back, it could destroy us in court." David's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what happened. I was just there, and then they said I did it. I didn't. I couldn't." Clint sat quietly, letting the silence hang between them. The confession David had made wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an admission of fear. David didn't know what had happened that night, but he was being framed. Clint had known it all along, but now he had the confirmation. "David, you're not alone in this. I'm going to fight for you. And together, we'll get to the truth." The emotions that flooded Clint in that moment were overwhelming. He had been in tough situations before. on sets, on film sets, in interviews, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional toll of defending someone who was truly vulnerable, someone who had no choice but to place their trust in him. And yet, despite the emotional weight of the case, Clint's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about winning for the sake of winning. This was about justice. This was about making sure that David Taylor was given the chance to walk free if he was innocent. And Clint was going to fight for that, no matter the cost. The next day, Clint entered the courtroom with a new sense of determination. He knew that the moment had arrived for him to make his move. The emotional stakes had never been higher. It wasn't just about presenting facts anymore. It was about pulling the truth to the surface, no matter how difficult it might be to hear. As the trial progressed, Clint's focus was laser-sharp. He wasn't just answering objections or questioning witnesses. He was leading them down a path of discovery, one that was slowly and methodically unraveling the case against David. With each new piece of evidence Clint presented, the weight of the prosecutor's case seemed to crumble. The turning point came when Clint called his final witness, a forensic expert who had examined the evidence and found critical flaws in the prosecution's timeline. The expert's analysis of the evidence revealed that the robbery could not have happened as the prosecution claimed. There was a gap in the timeline that pointed to an alternative theory. David was nowhere near the scene when the crime occurred. The room erupted in murmurs as Clint stood, silently taking in the weight of the moment. This was his final blow. He had exposed the truth, and it was undeniable. Judge Hart, who had been so dismissive of Clint at the beginning, now sat quietly, his expression unreadable. He had been forced to listen, to reconsider his own judgments. It was over. The jury deliberated for hours, but Clint knew that the truth had been laid out for them. There was no longer any room for doubt. The emotional climax had come to its peak, and now the resolution was waiting to unfold. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the room fell silent. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained calm, as if he were preparing for the final scene in one of his films. He knew how this worked. He had done it 1,000 times before. But this time, it wasn't a script. It was real. The foreman of the jury stood up, his voice clear and strong as he spoke the words Clint had been waiting for. "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Taylor, not guilty." The weight of those words hung in the air, and Clint felt the release of tension that had been building in him for days. It wasn't just relief, it was triumph. But it wasn't the kind of triumph that felt hollow or empty. This was the kind of triumph that came from knowing that justice had prevailed and that a life had been saved. David Taylor's face lit up with gratitude and disbelief as he turned to Clint, his eyes filled with tears. For the first time in a long time, there was hope in his eyes. The emotional journey they had both been on had reached its peak, and now they had reached the end. As Clint watched David walk out of the courtroom, free, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. It had been a long, hard fight, but in the end, the truth had won. And Clint Eastwood, the man who had faced countless battles both on screen and off, knew that this victory, this moment of justice, was the most important one of all. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that was both relieving and surreal. The gavel had fallen, and the judge's words still echoed in Clint Eastwood's mind. Not guilty. David Taylor, the young man Clint had fought for, was free. As the jury filed out of the courtroom, many of them offered Clint looks of approval, some even nodding respectfully. It wasn't just about the verdict anymore. It was about how Clint had changed the course of the trial. He had done what others didn't think possible. He had found the cracks in the case and laid them bare for everyone to see. But more than that, Clint had navigated the complex emotions of the trial with a grace and conviction that spoke volumes. This wasn't just about legal prowess. It was about heart, the very thing that could tip the scales in a trial that, in the beginning, seemed all but lost. Clint glanced over at David, who was still sitting at the defense table, his face flushed with disbelief and joy. For a moment, Clint saw the young man as if for the first time. The same person who had entered the courtroom days ago with fear in his eyes now sat before him, transformed. A smile crept across Clint's face. He had won not just for David, but for himself too. This victory wasn't about proving something to the world, or even to the jury. It was about making sure that justice, no matter how elusive, had the chance to take root. David stood up slowly, his movements tentative as if unsure of the reality of the moment. Clint walked toward him, offering a hand that was met with a firm, grateful grip. "Thank you," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was more powerful than any words Clint had ever heard. Clint nodded, his eyes softening with respect. "You did nothing wrong. I'm just glad I could help." The emotional journey of the past week hit Clint all at once. He had been so focused on winning the case that he hadn't allowed himself the space to reflect on the human aspect of it all. Now, as he stood there, looking at David, he saw beyond the legalities. He saw the hope in this young man's eyes, the hope that had been so nearly extinguished by the weight of a wrongful accusation. Clint knew that he had given David a second chance, and in that moment, he realized that this was the true reward. Later that day, Clint walked out of the courthouse. The street was busy with people coming and going, but Clint felt like he was in a world of his own. The noise of the city seemed distant, and for the first time in a long time, Clint felt a deep sense of peace. It had been a fight, a hard one, but he had come out victorious. The case had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. He had confronted his own doubts, his own fears, and now, standing outside the courthouse, he felt as though he had finally come to terms with them. He was pulled out of his thoughts when a familiar voice called to him. "Clint." Turning, Clint saw his old friend and mentor, Judge Henry Roberts, approaching. Judge Roberts had been a constant figure in Clint's life, someone who had guided him through the early stages of his legal career and had always been there to offer a word of advice or encouragement. "Judge Roberts," Clint greeted him with a smile. "Good to see you." The judge came up beside him, shaking his head in amusement. "I watched you in there. I've got to admit, Clint, I didn't know you had it in you. You took that case, made it yours, and you never once backed down. You were amazing." Clint chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "It wasn't easy, but sometimes you just know what you have to do." "True," Judge Roberts agreed. "And you did it. You gave that boy a chance, Clint. Not everyone would have taken that kind of fight. You're a credit to the law. I'm proud of you." The words struck Clint harder than he expected. Hearing that kind of praise from someone he respected so much meant more than any victory in court. It was validation, not just for his legal skills, but for his character. It reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place, not for glory or recognition, but because there was something deeply rewarding about knowing that you were doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Clint looked out at the city around him. "I'm glad it worked out, but the truth is, I couldn't have done it without David. He was the one who gave me the courage to fight. If he hadn't trusted me, none of this would have happened." Judge Roberts gave him a knowing smile. "That's the thing about justice, Clint. It's not just about what we do for others. It's about what they do for us, too. You didn't just help David. You helped yourself." Clint took a deep breath, the weight of the trial finally lifting off his shoulders. As he glanced up at the skyline, he realized that, despite all the battles, the doubts, and the obstacles, he had found something greater than victory: peace. In defending David Taylor, Clint had confronted his own demons and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more at peace with the man he was. Later that night, Clint sat alone in his office, reviewing the case one last time. The file was thick with paperwork, but Clint didn't feel the usual sense of urgency to rush through it. There was no more pressure to prove anything, no more unanswered questions. The case had been closed, and the truth had won. As he closed the file and leaned back in his chair, Clint realized that this trial, this case, had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. It had reminded him of the importance of truth, of perseverance, and of believing in people, something he hadn't done in a long time. The work he did mattered, but it was the people he fought for, the ones who needed his help, that gave his work purpose. Clint stood up, stretching his legs and walking to the window. The moonlight bathed the city in a soft glow, and for a moment, everything felt still. The world was quiet, and Clint found solace in that. He had fought for justice, and justice had been served. But beyond the legal victories, beyond the headlines and accolades, Clint knew that the true victory lay in the heart. He had made a difference, and that was all that mattered. The days following David Taylor's acquittal were a whirlwind of media attention and public acclaim. Clint Eastwood's name was on everyone's lips, and reporters, eager to get a glimpse of the man who had turned the case on its head, followed him at every turn. He had become a symbol of not just legal brilliance, but of hope. Hope that the truth could still emerge from the depths of injustice, even when it seemed buried under layers of doubt. But Clint was no stranger to the spotlight. He had spent decades under it, from his early days in Hollywood to his more recent work as a director and producer. Still, this was different. The attention wasn't just for his celebrity. It was for something deeper, something that made him feel uncomfortable, but also oddly proud. As Clint sat in his office, reviewing the case one last time, he reflected on what had led him here. The press conference he had given after the verdict, where he had stood tall and confident, was already making waves. His calm demeanor had stunned even the most seasoned reporters. "I'm just doing my job," Clint had told them, his voice steady. "Nothing more, nothing less. The law is about seeking the truth, and that's all I did." But the truth was, Clint felt a mix of emotions that he hadn't anticipated. Part of him was content, proud even, but another part felt strangely hollow. He had won the case, but now what? What did it mean to have fought so hard for someone's freedom, only for it to become just another headline in a sea of news stories? He glanced out the window at the bustling city below, the familiar sight doing little to ease his growing sense of unease. The world was moving on, and Clint felt a strange sense of detachment from it all. The trial was over, and David was free, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Clint was jolted out of his thoughts when his phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the stillness of his office. It was an unknown number, and for a moment, he hesitated. But then, something in the back of his mind told him to answer. "Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice a mixture of curiosity and weariness. "Mr. Eastwood," a familiar voice replied on the other end. "This is David. David Taylor." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from David since the trial. He had expected the young man to move on with his life, to leave the past behind him. But hearing from him now, so soon after the case, felt significant. "David, how are you?" Clint asked, his tone warm but cautious. "I'm doing okay, better, actually," David said, his voice quieter than it had been during the trial. "But I wanted to call and thank you again. I don't think I've fully processed everything, but I know that you're the reason I'm not sitting in prison right now. You gave me a second chance at life." Clint leaned back in his chair, absorbing the gravity of David's words. He had heard thanks before, but something about David's tone struck him deeper than the usual expressions of gratitude. It was sincere, raw. "I was just doing my job," Clint replied, trying to keep his emotions in check. "It's not about me, David. It's about you. You deserve to be free." "I know," David said, "but it's not just that. It's everything. You didn't just help me out of a legal mess. You showed me something I didn't think I'd ever see again. You showed me hope." Clint felt a lump form in his throat. He had known that defending David had been the right thing to do, but hearing it so plainly, hearing how his actions had changed someone's life, was a reminder of just how significant his work could be. "David, I'm glad I could help," Clint said, his voice softening. "But you did all the hard work. You trusted me, and that trust made all the difference." There was a long pause before David spoke again. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next. I don't know where to go from here. I've spent so much time in fear of what would happen if I was found guilty that I don't know how to live without that weight on my shoulders." Clint could sense the uncertainty in David's voice. "Take it one step at a time, David. You've got a chance to start over. That's more than most people get." "I don't know how to start over," David admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't know where to begin." Clint thought for a moment, then offered a piece of advice that he had learned long ago. "You start by forgiving yourself. The past is behind you now. You've been given a new lease on life. What you do with it is up to you. Just make sure you don't waste it." David was silent for a moment before he finally spoke, a note of gratitude in his voice. "Thank you, Clint, for everything. I won't waste it." Clint hung up the phone with a heavy heart, a feeling of quiet satisfaction lingering. He had given David the chance to start over, but the real work would be David's. Clint had done his part, but now the young man had to decide what kind of life he wanted to live. The days turned into weeks, and Clint tried to settle back into his routine. The media buzz had faded, and the case that had consumed so much of his energy was now just a chapter in the past. But Clint couldn't help but feel like there was more to the story, more that he hadn't yet understood. He often found himself thinking about David, about the young man who had been given a second chance. What would he do with it? Would he be able to move forward, or would the past continue to haunt him? Clint didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. Justice was a powerful thing. It didn't just change the lives of those it affected. It changed the people who fought for it. Clint had learned that fighting for what was right wasn't just about winning a case. It was about something deeper, something that lived in the heart. He had seen it in David's eyes, the way hope had rekindled in him, and Clint realized that, in a way, he too had been given a second chance. A second chance to find peace, to find purpose, and to remember why he had chosen this path in the first place. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a man who believed in the power of redemption, who had seen it firsthand, and who would continue to fight for it, no matter where the journey took him next. And as Clint sat back in his chair, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The aftermath of the case hadn't been about the accolades or the praise. It had been about the change he had witnessed, both in David and in himself. For Clint Eastwood, this case had been a reminder that, even in a world that often felt uncertain, there was always hope, always a chance for redemption. And sometimes that was all that really mattered. Clint Eastwood stood at the window of his office, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The streets hummed with life, cars weaving through intersections, pedestrians rushing to and fro. Yet, for Clint, the world outside seemed strangely distant, as if it were moving at a pace too quick for him to catch up. It had been weeks since the trial, but his mind remained preoccupied with the questions that still lingered in his heart. What comes next? For most people, the aftermath of a legal battle would be a time for celebration or relaxation. They would enjoy the fruits of their labor and move on. But Clint wasn't like most people. The work he did, defending the innocent, fighting for justice, wasn't just a job. It was a calling, and the satisfaction of winning a case was often short-lived. There was always another case, another fight waiting on the horizon. The thought of continuing this cycle, endless cases, endless battles, left Clint feeling weary. Something had shifted within him during the trial, something he couldn't easily explain. Maybe it was the way he had seen David Taylor's life change before his very eyes. Maybe it was the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done more than just win a case. He had given someone a chance at a fresh start. Clint sighed and turned away from the window, walking toward his desk. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence, and he picked it up with a sense of resignation. It was a message from his old friend, Judge Henry Roberts. "Clint, I wanted to reach out. I've been hearing some whispers around town. People are saying your legal expertise is the best they've seen in years. I was hoping we could meet up. I think I have something you'd be interested in. Call me when you get a chance." Clint's fingers hovered over the screen as he debated whether or not to call back. Judge Roberts was a seasoned veteran of the legal world, someone Clint had always respected. But Clint wasn't sure he was ready to dive into another case. He had seen too much over the years, the darkness, the corruption, and the pain, and he wasn't sure he could stomach it again. But as he set the phone down and gazed back out the window, something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had driven him for as long as he could remember: helping people. Clint reached for his phone once more and dialed Judge Roberts' number. It rang 3 times before the voice on the other end answered. "Clint." Judge Roberts greeted him warmly. "Glad to hear from you." "What's going on, Henry?" Clint asked, leaning back in his chair. "You mentioned something about an opportunity. What's the deal?" "I'll get right to the point," Judge Roberts said, his voice serious now. "There's a case coming up. It's not your typical case, Clint. It's a complicated one, and it's going to take someone with your experience to navigate it. I can't say much more right now, but I know you're the right person for it." Clint's brow furrowed, curiosity piqued. "What kind of case?" Judge Roberts paused before speaking again, choosing his words carefully. "I'll explain everything in person. How about we meet at the old diner down on Oak Street? I think it's time you heard the full story. Clint agreed, feeling a mixture of hesitation and intrigue. He had always trusted Judge Roberts' judgment, but this didn't sound like a typical case. Something told him that what lay ahead would challenge him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The next afternoon, Clint made his way to the diner on Oak Street, a place he had frequented many years ago. The diner was small, cozy, and filled with the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee. It hadn't changed much over the years, and Clint appreciated the familiarity of the place. As he entered, he spotted Judge Roberts sitting at a booth in the back, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Clint made his way over and slid into the booth across from the judge. "I was starting to wonder if you'd show up," Judge Roberts joked, his eyes twinkling. Clint chuckled. "You know I don't keep you waiting." "So, what's this case you're talking about?" Clint asked, his curiosity building. Judge Roberts leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "There's a man named Thomas Caldwell. He's a former CEO of a major tech company. He's facing charges of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and a whole list of other crimes. But here's the catch. The evidence is thin, Clint. It's a lot of circumstantial stuff, but there's something about this case that doesn't sit right with me." Clint leaned forward, intrigued. "You think he's innocent?" "I don't know," Judge Roberts admitted. "But I do know this. Something doesn't add up. Caldwell is claiming he's being set up. He's adamant about it, but no one seems to believe him. That's where you come in. I need you to take a look at the case, see if there's something we've missed. You're the best at finding the truth, Clint." Clint paused, considering the offer. It wasn't the kind of case he had been looking for. Big corporations, high-profile individuals, and a slew of complex legal battles. But something about the uncertainty of it all pulled at him. He had walked away from this kind of work before, but this time, it felt different. It felt like he was being pulled back into the fight for something bigger than himself. "You know I don't do these high-profile cases anymore," Clint said, his voice low. "I've seen enough of that world. The lies, the corruption." Judge Roberts nodded, understanding Clint's reluctance. "I get it, Clint, but this one feels different. I can't shake the feeling that there's something more to this case. Something that's being hidden." Clint stared at the table for a moment, weighing his options. He had spent years fighting battles like this, cases that seemed impossible to win, with enemies that were too powerful to defeat. But now, after the trial with David, he had a renewed sense of purpose. He had seen how a person's life could change with the right kind of fight. Maybe this was his chance to make a real difference again. "I'll take a look," Clint finally said, his voice steady. "But if I do this, I'm all in. I'm not walking away halfway." Judge Roberts smiled, a look of approval crossing his face. "That's what I was hoping to hear. I knew you'd be the right man for the job." Clint's mind raced as he thought about what lay ahead. The case would be complicated, full of twists and turns. But in that moment, Clint knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. And for the first time in a long time, Clint Eastwood felt alive with purpose. Clint Eastwood stood at the front of his office, the case file for Thomas Caldwell spread out before him. The stack of documents was thick, packed with financial statements, emails, and testimonies from a long list of individuals. Yet, despite the sheer volume of information, Clint's mind kept drifting back to the one thing that had been gnawing at him since his conversation with Judge Roberts. Why did this case feel different? It had been years since Clint had worked on a corporate fraud case. The high-profile nature of these cases always came with layers of politics, media manipulation, and hidden agendas. It was a world that Clint had walked away from for a reason. But now, here he was again, delving into the depths of a corporate scandal that threatened to ruin a man's life. Clint had always believed in the power of truth, but in these types of cases, the truth was often buried beneath the weight of powerful interests. Yet, something in Thomas Caldwell's story had struck a chord with him. Caldwell's insistence that he was being framed for crimes he didn't commit seemed genuine. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, no sense of entitlement, just a quiet desperation. The man had been a successful CEO, but now, all that success was in jeopardy, and Caldwell was fighting to protect not only his reputation but his freedom. Clint sifted through the case files, his sharp eyes scanning for inconsistencies. As he went through the pile of evidence, it became clear that the case was not as straightforward as it seemed. There were gaps in the timeline, discrepancies in the financial records, and suspicious behavior from some of Caldwell's colleagues. But what stood out the most were the phone records, records that showed Caldwell had been in a different city at the time the alleged fraudulent transactions took place. Could this be the smoking gun that would clear Caldwell's name? Or was it just another detail that could be easily dismissed? Clint wasn't sure yet, but he was determined to find out. Later that afternoon, Clint drove to the address listed in the case file, a nondescript office building located on the outskirts of the city. The building was old, its paint peeling and windows fogged with age, but it was here that Thomas Caldwell had worked until his arrest. Clint had made the decision to meet with Caldwell in person to get a better sense of the man he was defending. The best lawyers didn't just go off the facts, they got to know the people behind the case. As Clint entered the building, he was greeted by a receptionist who looked as though she hadn't smiled in years. She directed him to an elevator at the end of the hall, and soon Clint was on his way up to the top floor, where Caldwell's office had been located. The elevator doors opened with a quiet ding, revealing a spacious, yet empty floor. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and dust. Clint walked down the hall to a small office at the end of the corridor. The door was ajar, and inside, he could see a man sitting behind a desk, his face creased with age and worry. Thomas Caldwell didn't look like a typical CEO. His suit was unkempt, his tie loosened at the collar, and there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. Clint knocked softly on the doorframe, and Caldwell looked up. The two men exchanged a brief but meaningful glance before Clint stepped inside and took a seat across from him. "Mr. Eastwood," Caldwell said, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up." Clint smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't back out of a fight once I'm in it." Caldwell nodded slowly, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "I'm glad to hear that, because, frankly, I'm running out of options." Clint sat back, studying Caldwell for a moment. "You're telling me you didn't do it, but the evidence seems pretty stacked against you." "I didn't," Caldwell said, his voice almost a whisper. "I swear to you, Clint, someone's framing me. I don't know who, but I'm being set up." Clint leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about the day the fraud happened. Where were you?" "I was in Chicago for a conference," Caldwell replied. "I have the flight records to prove it. But the company's financials are showing that I approved a transfer of funds while I was away. That's impossible. I didn't do it." Clint tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "What about the people around you? Any enemies? People who might want to see you fall?" Caldwell's face darkened. "There were always people who didn't like me. It's part of the job, right? But nothing like this. This is something else. It's personal." Clint's instincts kicked in. He had worked with enough high-profile clients to know that there were always people lurking in the shadows, waiting for a chance to take someone down. But this felt different. There was no arrogance in Caldwell's voice, no attempt to deflect blame. He was a man on the edge, grasping at any thread of hope. "I'm going to help you," Clint said firmly, "but you need to be honest with me. No secrets. No lies. I can't defend you if I don't have the whole picture." Caldwell nodded, the weight of Clint's words sinking in. "I understand. I'll tell you everything." As Clint left Caldwell's office, he felt the first stirrings of clarity. The case was far more complicated than he had initially thought. There were too many unanswered questions, too many holes in the narrative. But Clint's gut told him that Caldwell was telling the truth. He wasn't some corrupt CEO looking for a way out. He was a man caught in a web of deceit, a man who had been pushed into a corner. Now, Clint had to figure out how to unravel that web. Back at his office, Clint pored over the case files once more, this time with a renewed sense of determination. There was something in the phone records that still didn't sit right with him. Why had Caldwell's colleagues been so adamant about pinning the blame on him? And who had the power to manipulate the evidence so effectively? Clint didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This case was far from over. And as he delved deeper into the investigation, Clint realized that the stakes were higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about a corporate fraud case. This was about exposing a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of the very company Caldwell had once led. and Clint Eastwood wasn't going to stop until he found the truth. Clint Eastwood's days were blurring together now. The once tranquil rhythm of his life had been replaced by a ceaseless wave of questions, new revelations, and the ever-growing weight of the case he had agreed to take on. Each day seemed to bring a new discovery, a new piece to the puzzle that was Thomas Caldwell's life. Yet, despite the mounting evidence and the pressing urgency of the situation, Clint remained steadfast in his belief that something deeper was at play here, something he had yet to uncover. The quiet hum of his office felt like a distant echo as he scrolled through a set of new documents he had received from Caldwell's former colleague, Samantha Hayes. Hayes was an analyst who had worked closely with Caldwell, and though her involvement in the case seemed minimal at first, Clint had learned from Caldwell that she had been one of the few people still willing to speak on his behalf. According to the documents, Hayes had compiled a series of spreadsheets and financial reports that suggested a pattern of irregularities within the company's finances, irregularities that were consistent with fraudulent activity. But there was a problem. The transactions that seemed to implicate Caldwell didn't add up. The dates were conflicting, and the amounts involved didn't match up with the company's previous spending habits. It was as if someone had intentionally altered the financial records to create a trail that led straight to Caldwell, but the true culprit was someone else entirely. Clint's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of information. He had already requested a full audit of the company's books and had contacted some of Caldwell's former employees who might have insight into the inner workings of the business. But what struck Clint the most was the fact that there was a strange consistency to the evidence, too consistent. Whoever had orchestrated this plot had done so with meticulous precision, anticipating every move Clint might make. Something didn't sit right. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to take down Caldwell. They were sending a message. The next morning, Clint sat in the small, dimly lit conference room with Samantha Hayes. She had agreed to meet him in person, despite the risks involved. Hayes had been hesitant to speak out at first, but as she learned more about Caldwell's situation, she became convinced that the truth needed to be uncovered. Her trust in Clint was palpable, and as they went over the evidence together, Clint noticed the strain in her voice. "I never thought I'd find myself here," Samantha said, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "But now that I see everything laid out in front of me, I can't ignore it anymore. There's something going on at this company, Clint. Something bigger than any of us." Clint's eyes narrowed as he stared at the financial reports in front of him. Bigger than corporate fraud? Samantha hesitated before responding, her eyes darting toward the door as if to make sure they were alone. "Yes. I think there's been a deliberate effort to hide something far more dangerous. I think someone is laundering money through the company. And I'm not just talking about a small operation here, Clint. I'm talking about a network that stretches far beyond this building. These transactions don't just lead back to Caldwell. They're connected to other companies, other countries." Clint's mind started to connect the dots. This was no longer just about a man being framed. This was a tangled web of international money laundering, organized crime, and corporate manipulation. A plot so vast that it could bring down multiple industries, not just one CEO. But why would Caldwell be the one they choose to frame? Clint asked, more to himself than to Samantha. Why not someone who doesn't have as much power or influence? Samantha sighed, clearly burdened by the weight of her own thoughts. "I don't know. Maybe he knew too much. Maybe he was getting too close to something." There were rumors before the scandal broke. Rumors that Caldwell was planning a major merger with an international partner. He was about to move the company into new markets, ones that would have put him at the top of the food chain. And that's when the accusations started. Clint stood up and began pacing the room. "So, you're saying someone wanted to take him down before he could expose something bigger?" Samantha nodded gravely. "Exactly. And now that we're looking at the company's financials, I'm convinced that this is much more than a personal vendetta. Caldwell was a pawn in a much larger game." Clint stopped pacing and turned toward her. "I'm going to need your help. I can't take this down alone. We need to find someone on the inside, someone who knows exactly what's going on." Samantha's eyes widened. "I've already been thinking about that. There's one person, someone who's been on the periphery of all of this. A man named Gregory Talbot. He's been Caldwell's right hand for years, but he suddenly left the company after the scandal broke. I've always thought there was more to his departure than he let on. He's the key to everything. Clint's eyes locked onto hers. Where can I find him? Later that day, Clint drove to a quiet, upscale part of the city. He had arranged to meet Gregory Talbot at a small cafe, one that he frequented when he needed to avoid the prying eyes of the corporate world. Talbot was a man who had risen quickly through the ranks at Caldwell's company, and his sudden departure after the scandal raised more than a few eyebrows. As Clint entered the cafe, he spotted Talbot sitting in a corner booth, looking just as polished and composed as he had during his days as Caldwell's trusted advisor. There was a coldness to Talbot now, a sharp edge to his demeanor that Clint had not expected. Talbot looked up as Clint approached, his eyes narrowing slightly before he offered a tight smile. "Mr. Eastwood," Talbot said, his voice smooth but guarded. "I've been expecting you." Clint slid into the booth across from him, not wasting any time. "I don't have time for games, Talbot. I need information. And I think you know exactly what's been happening at that company." Talbot raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip from his coffee before speaking again. "I know a lot of things, Clint. Things I'd rather not be involved in. But if you're asking me to get my hands dirty for you, I'm going to need more than just your word." Clint leaned in, his voice low and unwavering. "You don't have a choice. Caldwell is innocent. And if you want to protect your own neck, you'll help me expose the truth." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Talbot studied Clint carefully. Then, with a resigned sigh, he leaned back in his seat. "All right, I'll talk. But you need to understand something, Clint. What you're getting into, it's bigger than anything you've ever dealt with." Clint didn't flinch. "I've dealt with plenty, Talbot. Now, tell me everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" The weight of the truth began to sink in. Clint Eastwood had always known that the world of corporate fraud could be murky. But this was something else entirely. What had started as an effort to clear Thomas Caldwell's name had quickly spiraled into a labyrinth of international crime, money laundering, and corporate espionage. Clint's mind churned as he tried to piece together the fragments of information that had been slowly accumulating over the last few days. Gregory Talbot's words echoed in Clint's mind. "What you're getting into, it's bigger than anything you've ever dealt with." Clint had heard those kinds of warnings before, but this felt different. Talbot wasn't some informant trying to cover his own tracks. There was genuine fear in his voice, a sense of impending danger that Clint hadn't fully grasped until now. This wasn't just a case of corporate misconduct. This was the kind of situation that could destroy lives, change the balance of power, and ripple across the global economy in ways Clint couldn't even fathom. The drive back to his office felt like an eternity. Clint's fingers gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts racing. The trail had led him here, to Talbot, to Caldwell, and now to the murky underbelly of international business dealings. But where did it lead next? What was the next piece of the puzzle? As he walked through the front door of his office, Clint could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him. The usual hum of the office was absent. His assistant, Emily, was sitting at her desk, a stack of files in front of her. She looked up as he entered, concern written across her face. "Clint, we've got a problem," she said before he could even ask. Clint raised an eyebrow. "What kind of problem?" "It's Caldwell," Emily said, her voice tinged with urgency. "The press got a hold of something. They're already running stories about his involvement in the scandal. They've even got his arrest on video. It's a media storm." Clint cursed under his breath. This was the last thing they needed right now. The media frenzy would only make it harder for them to dig deeper into the truth. But Clint had no time to dwell on that. There was still too much at stake. "Where are the documents I asked for?" he asked, brushing past Emily to his desk. Emily handed him a file. "Here. I've compiled everything we've got on the financials, plus some of the background checks on Caldwell's associates." "But Clint, I don't think Caldwell's the only one in danger." Clint looked at her, his gaze sharp. "What do you mean?" "I've been digging into some of the people involved in the company," she said hesitantly. "There are more names coming up, people with connections to the kind of activities you're talking about. Money laundering, offshore accounts, international shell companies. I think Caldwell's just a pawn in a much bigger game." Clint's stomach tightened. The idea that Caldwell was just a pawn in this vast conspiracy made sense. At least now it did. But who was the puppet master behind it all? The next day, Clint drove to a private meeting with Samantha Hayes, who had agreed to provide him with more details about the internal workings of Caldwell's company. There was a sense of urgency in her voice over the phone, something that suggested she had uncovered something important. As Clint pulled up to the cafe where they had previously met, he noticed that she was already there, seated in a corner booth, her eyes scanning the room nervously. Samantha didn't waste time with pleasantries. She leaned forward as Clint sat down, her voice low and cautious. "I've been in contact with a former employee who used to work directly under Talbot," she said, her eyes darting around the cafe. "She's scared. She's afraid that if we keep pushing, things will get dangerous. But she's willing to talk. She knows things that could blow this whole thing wide open." Clint leaned in, his expression serious. "What kind of things?" Samantha hesitated for a moment before answering. "The money trail. It's not just about Caldwell or the company. The money's been funneled through a series of shell corporations across multiple countries, places like the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and even Russia. And it's not just Caldwell's company. There's a network of companies involved. It's been going on for years." Clint absorbed the information, his mind working overtime. "So, we're dealing with an international money laundering operation. And Caldwell's company is the front?" "That's right," Samantha confirmed. "But here's the twist. The people involved in this aren't just faceless corporations. There are powerful individuals with a lot to lose if this gets out. And they're willing to do anything to protect their interests." Clint's gaze hardened. "Including framing an innocent man?" "Exactly," Samantha said, nodding. "Caldwell's the perfect scapegoat. He's got the money, the power, but also the enemies. All they had to do was plant the evidence, create the narrative, and let the media do the rest." Clint felt a cold knot in his stomach. It was starting to make sense. The corporate world was ruthless, and people would go to any lengths to protect their secrets. But this was something else. This wasn't just a game of corporate espionage. This was a battle for control of billions, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. That afternoon, Clint met with his investigative team to go over the evidence they had gathered so far. They had a few pieces of the puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. As Clint sat in front of the whiteboard, outlining the connections between the shell companies, the money trail, and the individuals involved, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were just scratching the surface. One of his investigators, a sharp young woman named Rachel, pointed at a series of transactions on the board. "Clint, take a look at this. These payments are going from one of the shell companies to a trust fund in Switzerland. It's a standard setup for laundering money, but what catches my eye is the name attached to the trust." Clint leaned in, studying the name Rachel had circled. It was an old name, someone Clint had encountered in the past, someone who had been involved in a series of high-profile cases years ago. "This name," Clint murmured, "it can't be." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This is Victor Allen," Clint said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "He's one of the most notorious money launderers in the world. If he's involved in this, we're dealing with something far bigger than I thought." Clint's mind was reeling as he pieced together the implications of Allen's involvement. Victor Allen had been on the radar of global law enforcement agencies for years, but he had always managed to stay one step ahead. If he was involved in Caldwell's case, it meant the conspiracy went all the way to the top, implicating some of the most powerful people in the world. And now, Clint was at the center of it all. He knew that the only way to bring down the network was to expose the people behind it. But that would mean going up against some of the most dangerous individuals in the world. People who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The danger was real. But Clint had never been one to back down. Clint Eastwood had faced a fair share of danger in his time, whether in his cinematic career or as a real-life investigator. But this was something entirely different. He'd often told himself that the truth would always rise to the surface, that no matter how deep the corruption, it would eventually be uncovered. But now, as he stared at the sprawling network of financial ties, shell companies, and global power players, he realized just how naive that belief had been. The game had changed. What had started as a simple case to clear Thomas Caldwell's name had quickly become a complex web of international crime, deceit, and power. And Clint was caught right in the middle of it. He couldn't stop thinking about the name that had surfaced in their investigation. Victor Allen, the infamous money launderer, whose involvement in this case meant that everything was much bigger, much more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Allen was a shadowy figure, the kind of person who made headlines in whispers, not in the bright lights of the media. He was untouchable, elusive, and had the power to make anyone who crossed him disappear without a trace. Clint had always prided himself on his ability to navigate the world of criminal law. He could read people, understand their motives, and anticipate their moves. But Allen was different. Clint didn't just need to catch him, he needed to outsmart him. The day after Rachel's discovery, Clint met with his team in the office to finalize their next steps. They had a plan, but it was dangerous. Every move they made seemed to lead them deeper into a labyrinth of deceit, and Clint knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more perilous their situation became. "I've got a contact in Switzerland," Rachel said, as she slid a document across the table. "It's a long shot, but we might be able to trace the funds that were funneled through the trust. If we can follow that trail, it could lead us straight to Allen." Clint studied the paper, nodding. "It's risky, but it's the best shot we've got. If Allen's behind this, we need to get to him before he gets to us." "I agree," Rachel said, her voice tight with determination. "But we'll need to be careful. Allen has eyes everywhere. He's not someone we can just corner." Clint met her gaze. "I'm not planning on cornering him, Rachel. I'm planning on taking him down." Later that day, Clint found himself in an underground parking garage, preparing for a meeting with someone who could provide him with the final piece of the puzzle. His source was an informant who had once worked in one of Allen's businesses, a person who, for the right price, had agreed to speak out about the truth behind the operations. The meeting was risky, but Clint knew they had no other choice. He needed information that could directly connect Allen to the network behind Caldwell's framing. The informant, a nervous man in his early 30s, was waiting by a black sedan, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. Clint approached cautiously, his hand resting near the gun holstered at his side, just in case. "You Clint Eastwood?" the man asked in a whisper. "That's right," Clint replied, his voice calm but with an edge. "You've got the information?" The informant nodded quickly and handed over a small envelope. "You're going to want to take a look at this. It's the proof you need." Clint tore open the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs, financial documents, and a few handwritten notes. His eyes scanned them quickly, each one adding another layer to the story he was beginning to piece together. The documents were clear. Allen wasn't just laundering money, he was controlling it. And he was using Caldwell's company as a pawn to funnel billions through a series of fake mergers and backdoor deals. The final page, however, was the most chilling. A list of names, including Caldwell's, with an ominous note scrawled across the bottom, "End of the line for the rats." It was a death threat. Clint's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the smoking gun that could bring everything into the light. But it also meant that the clock was ticking. Allen knew they were getting close, and Clint knew better than anyone that someone like him wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got in his way. He shoved the envelope into his jacket and turned to leave, but the informant grabbed his arm. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't want any part of this anymore. I've already said too much. You need to get out of here before they come for you." Clint paused, then shook his head. "You did the right thing. You're out of it now." The informant stepped back, his face pale. "Just don't trust anyone, Clint. They're watching. They're always watching." Clint didn't say another word as he made his way back to the car. The informant's warning rang in his ears. They're always watching. It was a chilling reminder of how far-reaching Allen's influence was. Back at his office, Clint gathered his team and laid out the new information they had. The photographs, the documents, and the names all pointed to one inescapable truth. Allen was at the center of this conspiracy, and it was time to make him pay. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed to play this game with precision. "We move tomorrow," Clint said, his voice steady, but with an edge of finality. "We take down Allen before he can cover his tracks. We hit him where it hurts. The financials, the connections. We expose everything. No more games. Rachel nodded. I've got a team working on tracing the funds. If we can get the right authorities involved, we can make this official and force Allen into the open. Clint looked at his team, the gravity of the situation settling over him. This is it. This is the final push. We take down Allen, and Caldwell walks free. The plan was set into motion, and the next morning, Clint and his team boarded a private jet bound for Switzerland. They would need to be fast, careful, and above all, strategic. They were racing against time, against a powerful enemy, and against the clock. Allen wouldn't go down without a fight, and Clint knew that once they crossed the line, there was no turning back. As the plane ascended, Clint couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. What had started as a simple investigation had evolved into something far greater, far more dangerous. He had made enemies, crossed lines, and taken risks that had put his life in danger. But it had all been for one reason: to uncover the truth. And in this game, the truth was the most powerful weapon of all. He stared out the window, watching the clouds roll past beneath him, and thought about what awaited him on the other side. He was closer than ever to taking down the people who had framed Caldwell and exposed the darkness that lay at the heart of the corporate world. But Clint Eastwood wasn't afraid. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for the truth. And he was going to win. The plane touched down in Zurich just after dawn, the cold Swiss air cutting through Clint Eastwood's jacket as he stepped out onto the tarmac. He barely noticed the chill. His mind was consumed by the task at hand. This was it, the moment that could bring everything crashing down. The money trail was closer than ever, and the name Victor Allen was on the verge of being exposed. But Clint knew the risks. The closer they got, the more dangerous things became. He had made enemies, dangerous ones, and now he was hunting them down, one by one. He met with his team at a safe house just outside the city, a small but secure building nestled in the outskirts of Zurich. Inside, Rachel and a few other investigators were already setting up their computers, scanning through the latest data they had gathered. The urgency in the air was palpable, but Clint kept his focus. Rachel, looking determined but cautious, pulled up a map on the screen. "Here's the latest update on the accounts we've traced," she said, pointing at several marked locations. "Allen's network is more extensive than we first thought. These shell companies, all registered to different names, are just the tip of the iceberg. We've found connections to several banks here in Switzerland, but the money's been moved again. We need to track it down fast before Allen can cover his tracks." Clint nodded. "How much time do we have?" "Not much," Rachel answered grimly. "The longer we wait, the more likely it is that Allen will move the funds again or shut everything down. If he senses we're getting too close, he'll make sure we disappear." Clint's jaw tightened, his instincts telling him that the situation was even more dangerous than he had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far, and he wasn't about to let a criminal mastermind like Victor Allen walk away. Clint had seen plenty of shady characters in his time, but Victor Allen was a different breed. Allen's reputation was built on a legacy of elusiveness, always operating just below the radar. He had connections with the highest echelons of society, and if anyone could make him disappear, it was the people who were on his payroll. As Clint and his team studied the documents they had gathered, they realized that Allen wasn't just a criminal, he was the puppet master. He had orchestrated the entire financial operation from behind the scenes, and the people who worked for him were more loyal to money than to the law. The deeper they dug into Allen's past, the more chilling the revelations became. He wasn't just involved in money laundering. He was tied to international arms deals, drug trafficking, and even organized crime. His tentacles reached across continents, with enough power and influence to shut down anyone who got in his way. But Clint wasn't intimidated. This was his fight now, and he knew that if he could expose Allen's operations, he could bring the entire criminal empire to its knees. The question was how. The team spent the next few hours combing through the financial data, connecting dots and piecing together the puzzle. Each lead they followed seemed to take them a step closer to Allen's hidden fortress. But there was something more Clint needed to know. The final piece of the puzzle that would bring everything into the light. "Clint," Rachel said, her voice tinged with excitement, "I think we found it. Look at this." She pulled up a set of coordinates, an address in the middle of nowhere. Clint's eyes narrowed as he examined the screen. This is where it all connects, Rachel continued. Allen's been hiding his operations in plain sight. This place, it's an old bank facility, one that was closed down decades ago. But according to these records, it's been in use recently. Clint leaned in, his mind racing. It's not just a bank. It's a safe house, a fortress. And it's where Allen's been hiding all of his assets. Rachel's fingers flew across the keyboard. I'll get in touch with local authorities, but we'll need to move fast. We can't wait for official clearance. It'll take too long. Clint didn't need to hear more. He was already reaching for his jacket. We're going in now. Time is everything. The drive to the location was tense. Clint's team had rented several cars, staying low to avoid detection, and they approached the old bank building under the cover of night. The facility, a large, nondescript stone building with high security, loomed in front of them like a fortress. It was clear that Allen wasn't taking any chances. He had covered his tracks well, but not well enough. As they parked several hundred meters away, Clint's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was it, the final step in this dangerous game. They had the evidence. They had the coordinates. Now, they had to move fast and clean, or they would be caught in Allen's web. We have one shot at this, Clint said quietly, gathering his team around him. We get in, take the records, and get out. No messing around. If we alert Allen's men, we're done. Rachel nodded. We've got a clear route into the building. There's a back door that isn't heavily guarded. Clint's eyes hardened as he surveyed the building. He wasn't just going to expose Victor Allen. He was going to make sure Allen could never hurt anyone again. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal. It was about making sure the innocent, like Thomas Caldwell, could finally breathe easy. The infiltration was swift. Clint and his team moved silently, like shadows. They slipped past the guards with practiced ease, avoiding cameras and security checks as they made their way toward the vault. The tension was unbearable. Every footstep felt like a countdown to disaster. The closer they got, the more Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They reached the vault door. Rachel quickly got to work on the lock, and after a few moments, the heavy metal door creaked open. Inside were rows of files, documents, and digital records. Everything they needed to bring down Allen's entire operation. Clint's fingers brushed over the files, the magnitude of the evidence sinking in. Got it, Rachel said, her voice a mixture of relief and urgency. We've got everything we need. Let's move. But before they could leave, a voice echoed from the hallway. Not so fast. Clint's blood ran cold as he turned to face the man who had emerged from the shadows. Victor Allen himself, the mastermind behind everything. His cold, calculating eyes met Clint's, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. So, this is how it ends? Allen said, his voice smooth, like a predator toying with its prey. Clint's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his side. Not by a long shot. The air inside the old bank vault felt thick with tension. Clint Eastwood stood frozen, eyes locked with Victor Allen's, who had appeared as if summoned by fate itself. The moment had arrived, and Clint could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest, suffocating him with the realization of what was at stake. Victor Allen was no longer just a name. It was a shadow that loomed over the lives of everyone Clint had fought to protect. And now, Clint was standing face to face with that shadow. Allen's cold, predatory smile didn't waver. You think you've won, don't you, Clint? You think you're going to take me down with a handful of papers and some digital files? You're nothing but a pawn in this game. Clint didn't flinch. Maybe you're right, but I've played your game longer than you think, Allen. And the moment you started thinking you were untouchable, you made a mistake. Big one. Allen's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. You don't understand what you're up against. You've taken down a few of my men, but you're still standing in my house. You think you can walk out of here with those files? You're more delusional than I thought. The chilling realization hit Clint in that moment. Allen wasn't worried. He wasn't afraid. This was a man who had dealt with people like Clint before, and he had always found a way to win. But Clint wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. We're not walking out, Allen, Clint said, his voice low but firm. We're taking you down. Allen's laugh echoed in the cold silence of the vault. He stepped closer, his shoes tapping against the concrete floor. You think this is about winning, Clint? This is about survival. I've survived things you can't even imagine. You think you've got what it takes to end me? You don't even know the half of it. As Clint moved closer to Allen, the tension in the room grew thicker, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. He had the evidence, and Allen knew it. But what Allen didn't realize was that Clint wasn't just after Allen's wealth or his empire. This wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was personal. Let's see if your empire holds up under pressure, Victor, Clint said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out the envelope filled with the damning evidence. The game is over. The truth is out. Clint threw the contents onto the floor, watching as the documents and photos spilled across the cold concrete. Allen's eyes flickered with the briefest hint of panic. For a moment, Clint thought he saw a crack in the impenetrable facade, the carefully cultivated mask of power that had kept Allen untouchable for so long. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculating demeanor that Clint had come to expect. "You really think this changes anything?" Allen said, his voice now laced with venom. "You're nothing but a distraction, a small blip in a much larger picture. You and your team have no idea what you're up against." Clint stood tall, refusing to let the words shake him. He had already seen enough of this man's lies, his manipulations. There was no turning back now. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Clint's instincts immediately kicked into overdrive. Allen wasn't alone. His men were close, too close. Clint could already hear them, moving into position, preparing to surround them. "Looks like your backup is here, Victor," Clint said, his hands subtly moving toward his gun. Allen's smile returned, darker than before. "I told you, Clint. You're out of your depth." In an instant, the silence was shattered by the sharp clatter of heavy boots against the ground, followed by the sound of metal clicking against metal. Clint's team had positioned themselves well, and the room quickly filled with armed men, each one ready for the confrontation that had been brewing for months. "Clint," Rachel called out from the doorway, her voice tense, "we need to move. This place is a death trap." Clint barely acknowledged her, keeping his eyes fixed on Allen, watching for any sign of weakness. His mind raced, calculating his options, weighing the risks. "Get your men out of here, Allen," Clint said, his voice calm but fierce. "You've lost. You can either walk away, or you can die trying to protect a sinking ship." Allen took a step back, his eyes darting around the room as if weighing his options. For the first time since Clint had laid eyes on him, Allen looked uncertain, unsure of how to handle the pressure. "Do you think they'll just let you take me down?" Allen spat. "You think this is how it ends? You've already signed your death warrant." But Clint wasn't fazed. His mind was laser-focused, scanning every detail, calculating his next move. It happened in a split second. The sound of gunfire rang out, deafening and chaotic, as the room exploded into action. Clint ducked instinctively, his body moving on pure reflex as the first shots fired past him, striking the stone walls around him. His team dove for cover, exchanging fire with Allen's men. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus remained sharp. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had been in worse situations. Hell, he had faced down armed criminals in more intense circumstances. But this was different. This was about justice. And this time, he wasn't going to let the bad guy win. Allen ducked behind a steel pillar, shouting orders to his men, but Clint could see the fear in his eyes now. Allen was desperate, and that desperation made him dangerous. Clint sprinted forward, moving with calculated precision, dodging another round of bullets as he closed the distance between himself and Allen. He reached for his gun, but Allen's men were everywhere, behind pillars, around corners, using the chaos to their advantage. "Rachel," Clint shouted, "flank them. We need to get out of here with the files." Rachel's voice crackled over the comms. "On it. Stay low." Clint could hear her moving through the building, coordinating with the others as they created distractions and cleared a path toward the exit. But Allen was still fighting back, trying to get to the files, trying to protect his empire. Clint reached the pillar where Allen was hiding and pressed himself against it, taking a deep breath. The next few seconds would determine everything. Allen turned, his gun raised. But Clint was quicker. With the precision of a seasoned professional, Clint fired 2 quick shots, disarming Allen and sending him crashing to the ground. Allen's gun slid across the floor, and for a brief moment, he looked defeated. Clint stood over him, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on his shoulders. "It's over, Victor," Clint said, his voice cold. "You're done." As the authorities arrived, securing Allen and his men, Clint took a deep breath. It was over. The game was done. But the battle was far from finished. There would be consequences, and there would be people who would try to stop him. But Clint had won. The truth had finally come to light. Clint looked around at his team. Rachel, who had stayed by his side through it all, gave him a brief nod of approval. "We did it," she said. Clint allowed himself a rare smile. "Yeah, we did." And just like that, the storm that had started with the framing of Thomas Caldwell had come to an end. But Clint knew better than anyone. There would always be more storms ahead. For now, though, they had one. And that was enough. The dust settled slowly, but Clint Eastwood felt like the world was still spinning. The sharp tang of gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the cold, sterile atmosphere of the bank vault where everything had just gone down. His pulse was still racing, but the adrenaline had begun to fade, replaced by a deep, satisfying relief. Victor Allen, the mastermind behind an international criminal empire, was finally under arrest, his empire crumbling with every passing second. Clint took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the chaos around him. His team was already securing the area, rounding up the remaining members of Allen's crew. Local law enforcement had arrived in full force, sweeping through the building and ensuring that no one else was hiding in the shadows. "Clint," Rachel called out, walking toward him with a look of exhaustion, but also quiet triumph in her eyes. She held a handful of documents in her hand, evidence that had once seemed unreachable but now lay before them, ready to expose the truth. Clint turned toward her, giving her a nod. "We did it." Rachel smiled, though it was a weary smile, the weight of everything they had just been through weighing heavily on her shoulders. "Yeah, we did. But the work isn't over yet. This is just the beginning. The files we've got here, the ones we grabbed from Allen's vault, it's going to take weeks, maybe months, to go through all of it. And there are still people out there who are loyal to him. We haven't seen the last of his network." Clint exhaled slowly, his mind already ticking ahead to the next steps. One problem at a time. For now, we've got Allen, and that's the biggest piece of this puzzle. We've taken down the heart of the operation. Rachel nodded, but looked worried. "You think it's over, but people like him, they don't just fall quietly. There will be fallout. I'm worried about what's going to happen next." Clint's eyes narrowed. He had heard those words before, over and over again, from people who thought that bringing someone like Allen to justice would solve everything. But Clint knew better. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. People like Allen didn't just go away, and his connections ran deep. The question wasn't whether they'd try to take him down. It was how far they'd go to make sure Clint and his team never saw the light of day again. "We'll be ready for whatever comes next," Clint said, his voice hard and resolute. "Right now, our job is to make sure Allen faces justice. The rest, we'll handle that when it comes." The next few days were a blur. Clint and his team worked tirelessly with local authorities, helping to go through the mountains of evidence they had seized from the bank vault. The scope of Allen's operations was even bigger than they had initially realized. Money laundering, arms deals, human trafficking. Every illegal trade you could imagine had somehow been touched by his organization. But the most chilling discovery of all was the web of influence Allen had spun through global governments, banks, and private corporations. The files they uncovered were a roadmap of corruption, each document leading to someone else, someone more powerful than they could have ever anticipated. But Clint wasn't fazed by the sheer enormity of it all. The criminal empire might have been vast, but they had taken down its core. And once the heart of an empire was cut out, the rest would follow. It was just a matter of time before the whole thing unraveled. But as the team sifted through the documents, Clint found his thoughts drifting back to the moments in the vault, back to the face of Victor Allen. Allen had been confident, but Clint could see the cracks, the brief flashes of fear when he realized he was losing control. Clint had seen that fear in the eyes of countless criminals before, but this was different. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was the fear of losing everything, the fear of exposure. For Clint, it wasn't enough to take Allen down. The real challenge now was making sure that everything Allen had built didn't go unpunished. There were still too many loose ends, too many people out there who needed to be held accountable. Days turned into weeks. Allen's trial loomed large, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The case against him was solid, the evidence irrefutable. Clint stood beside Rachel as they entered the courthouse, the weight of the entire investigation behind them. This was it, the moment when the entire world would find out just how far Victor Allen had gone to hide his dark empire. Clint felt the familiar chill of determination settle in his chest. He wasn't nervous. He had been through enough high-stakes moments in his career to know what it meant to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the moment when everything they had fought for would come to fruition. As they walked into the courtroom, Clint's eyes briefly flicked to the judge sitting at the bench. It was a familiar face, a seasoned judge known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal cases. But there was something about today's proceedings that made Clint uneasy. He had been in enough courtrooms to recognize the politics that sometimes got in the way of justice. And when powerful people were involved, even the law could be bent. The trial began, and Clint took his seat in the gallery, watching as the legal teams presented their arguments. As expected, Allen's defense team tried everything in their power to discredit the evidence and undermine the witnesses. But the case was airtight. The truth was out, and no amount of legal maneuvering was going to change that. But then, something unexpected happened. Judge Langston, the man presiding over the case, began to make remarks that Clint found troubling. He questioned the legitimacy of the evidence, casting doubt on the documents they had seized from Allen's vault. It was subtle at first, just a passing comment about the manner in which the evidence had been gathered. But Clint could feel the shift. He wasn't the only one. Rachel shot him a glance from across the room, her expression one of concern. Clint stood up slowly, his heart racing. It was happening. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had played by the rules, and now the rules were being twisted. "I would like to call the next witness," Clint said, his voice steady as he stood up from the gallery. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. Judge Langston raised an eyebrow, his demeanor more than just professional. It was skeptical. "Mr. Eastwood, this is highly irregular," Judge Langston said. "You are not an attorney in this case. Do you have permission to speak?" Clint took a deep breath, his mind already racing. The truth was, he had no official standing in the case. But what he had was something more. An understanding of the law, of what was right, and the moral fortitude to do whatever it took to ensure justice was served. "I'm not an attorney, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice cutting through the silence. "But what I am is someone who has been in the trenches, fighting for justice. I've seen enough corrupt systems to know when one's about to fail." He paused, feeling the weight of the moment. "If you're questioning the integrity of the evidence presented, then I suggest you think very carefully. Because this is more than just paperwork. This is people's lives we're talking about." The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Clint Eastwood stood before Judge Langston, his voice unwavering. His every word seemed to reverberate off the walls, a quiet storm building inside the chamber. Rachel, seated beside him, exchanged a glance with their lead attorney, James McAllister, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The situation was spiraling out of control. The stakes had never been higher. "Your Honor, I understand this is highly irregular," Clint began, addressing Judge Langston directly. "But I can't stand by while Victor Allen's empire is protected by legal loopholes, all because of a few technicalities in how the evidence was obtained." Clint's words hung in the air, and the courtroom grew hushed, everyone awaiting the judge's response. The tension was so thick that it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Judge Langston, a man known for his strict adherence to the letter of the law, stared down at Clint, his expression unreadable. "I will remind you, Mr. Eastwood," Langston said slowly, his voice tinged with authority, "that you are not part of this case. You have no standing here. I would advise you to refrain from making any more statements unless you want to be held in contempt of court." The words hit Clint like a slap in the face. He knew this was a game. A game of power and influence. Langston wasn't simply following the law. He was protecting something bigger. And Clint wasn't going to back down. Not now. With all due respect, Your Honor, Clint said, his voice steady but firm. I didn't come here to play by the rules of corruption. I came here to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it costs. Clint's statement was a direct challenge, and the room seemed to shift as everyone processed his defiance. Langston's gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't the first time Clint had seen a judge play the system, but it was the first time he'd seen someone do it so openly. Mr. Eastwood, Langston said coldly, this is your last warning. Sit down, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. But Clint didn't sit. He stood tall, his eyes locked onto the judge, refusing to show any sign of weakness. The battle wasn't over, and Clint wasn't going to let Langston, or anyone else, derail the pursuit of justice. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low as she whispered in Clint's ear, Clint, we have to be careful. We don't know who Langston's working for, but he's playing both sides. We need to expose him. Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the judge, weighing his next words carefully. It was time to shift the dynamic, to take control of the room. I'll sit down when the truth is heard, Langston, Clint said, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a knife. And the truth is, Victor Allen is guilty. He's been running a criminal empire for years, and you know it. You know who he's connected to, and you know that if we let him walk, it's only a matter of time before more innocent lives are ruined. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of whispers, but Clint remained calm, standing his ground. Rachel's hand was on his shoulder now, a quiet reassurance in the midst of the storm. She knew better than anyone what Clint was capable of. But even she could sense that this wasn't just about Allen anymore. It was about exposing the larger web of corruption that had allowed someone like him to thrive for so long. Judge Langston's expression remained impassive, but Clint saw a flicker in his eyes, something that told him Langston wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. But Clint needed more than just suspicion. He needed proof. I'll allow a brief recess, Langston finally said, his voice sharp with irritation. But if you continue to disrupt this trial, Mr. Eastwood, I'll have no choice but to remove you from the proceedings. Clint didn't flinch. He nodded once, then turned toward Rachel. We have to move fast. Langston's either part of Allen's operation, or he's been compromised. Either way, we need to find out what we're dealing with. The team gathered in a back room during the recess, Clint's mind racing. James McAllister, their lead attorney, stood by the door, looking more frustrated than Clint had ever seen him. This is a disaster, McAllister muttered. Langston's not just playing dirty. He's actively obstructing justice. We've got a rock-solid case, and now we're stuck with this wild card in the mix. If we don't find a way to expose Langston, we're going to lose this case. Rachel paced across the room, her brow furrowed in thought. Clint, do you remember what you said about corruption? How these people protect each other? How they shield the ones in power? Langston's not just working with Allen. He's been doing this for years. It's not just about money. It's about control. Clint nodded. I know. And we're going to need something to bring Langston down. Something big. But it has to be solid, unshakable. James spoke up again, his voice sharp. We need to take the fight straight to Langston. He's been compromised. The question is how far this goes. We need to figure out who's pulling his strings, who's paying him off, and what he's getting in return. Clint ran a hand through his hair, the weight of everything they were up against settling on his shoulders. We don't have much time. If Langston is working with Allen, we'll need to move fast, before Langston can cover his tracks. Clint's instincts kicked into overdrive. He wasn't just facing a corrupt judge. He was facing an entire system stacked against him. But this wasn't the first time Clint had gone up against impossible odds. It was a game of strategy, a chess match where every move had to count. Clint turned to his team. Rachel, I need you to get in touch with our sources. We need to dig into Langston's financial records, his connections. If there's a paper trail, we'll find it. Rachel gave him a firm nod. I'm on it. James, I want you to get everything you can on Langston's past cases, Clint continued. Look for any discrepancies, any signs that he's been bought. We need to find a pattern of corruption, something concrete. James looked ready to argue, but Clint's tone left no room for debate. We do this now, or we lose everything. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of frantic phone calls, database searches, and covert meetings. Clint's team was working at full capacity, digging into Langston's past, tracking his connections, and finding out who had the power to manipulate him. Clint could feel the pressure mounting. He was about to make a move that could cost him everything, but he had no choice. By the time the recess was over and the trial resumed, Clint was ready. They had the evidence they needed, the smoking gun that would expose Judge Langston for what he really was. The question now wasn't whether they would take him down. It was whether they could do it before it was too late. As Clint walked back into the courtroom, he knew one thing for sure. The battle wasn't over. But he was no stranger to fighting back against the odds. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The air in the courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Clint Eastwood and his team prepared for the confrontation that would define their entire mission. Judge Langston sat at the bench, his gaze as cold and calculating as ever, while Clint stood in the center of the room, his mind razor-sharp. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about exposing Victor Allen's empire anymore. It was about tearing down the corrupt system that had allowed people like Allen and Langston to flourish unchecked for so long. Clint didn't flinch as he turned toward the judge, his eyes never leaving Langston's. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice steady and strong. "I've been in enough courtrooms to know when something isn't right. I've been watching you, and I've seen enough to know that you're compromised." The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Clint, who stood unwavering before the judge. Langston's eyes flickered briefly, just a flash, before he regained his composure, but Clint had seen it. The fear, the guilt. He wasn't going to let Langston cover it up any longer. "Mr. Eastwood," Langston said, his tone sharp, "I will have you removed if you continue with these accusations. You have no evidence to support this claim." Clint took a step forward, his voice growing louder, more assertive. "Oh, I have evidence, Your Honor, and not just some hearsay or speculation. I have hard, undeniable proof of your connections to Victor Allen's criminal enterprise. You've been taking bribes for years, laundering money, and protecting the most dangerous criminal in the world. You've been on his payroll." The murmurs in the room started to spread like wildfire. People shifted in their seats, glancing between Clint and Langston, unsure of how this was going to unfold. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Eastwood," Langston said, but there was a crack in his voice this time, a nervous edge. Clint wasn't buying it. He had the man in his sights, and now it was time to expose him. Clint pulled out a stack of documents from his briefcase and walked to the front of the courtroom. The papers were filled with bank records, financial transfers, and meeting schedules, proof of Langston's involvement in Allen's operations. He slid the documents onto the desk in front of Langston, making sure the judge couldn't ignore them. "I've got everything," Clint said, his voice rising with conviction. "And you've been making sure that Allen walks free every time. Your hands are as dirty as his." Langston's face paled, and for a split second, Clint saw him swallow hard. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth had been laid bare. There was no escaping it now. "We've traced every transaction," Clint continued. "Every bribe you've taken, every piece of evidence you've tried to bury. It's all right here, Your Honor. You've been paid to cover for Allen, to ensure his empire continues unchecked. And now the truth is out. You're finished." The room erupted in a mixture of shock and disbelief. Whispers spread like wildfire as the people in the courtroom absorbed the gravity of Clint's accusations. The lead prosecutor, a man Clint had known for years, stood frozen, his mouth agape as he processed the evidence. The defense attorneys, once so confident in Allen's victory, now looked nervously to Langston. And Langston? He was visibly rattled. He didn't respond immediately. His hands gripped the edges of the bench, his knuckles white as he tried to compose himself. But Clint could see the panic in his eyes. The judge knew he was cornered. The walls were closing in. "You're lying," Langston finally said, his voice shaking, but the uncertainty in his tone betrayed the anger. "This is a smear campaign. I won't allow this." "You'll never?" But Clint interrupted him, cutting through the judge's denials with a finality that left no room for doubt. It's over, Langston. You've been compromised, and we have enough to bring you down. It's not just about you anymore. It's about everyone you've protected, everyone you've let off the hook. Allen, his people, the other officials you've been covering for. This isn't just one person you're taking down. This is an entire network of corruption, and it's time for it to end. The courtroom was in chaos. The bailiffs had moved quickly, positioning themselves around Langston. They could see the writing on the wall. The judge had been exposed, and now it was only a matter of time before the authorities took him into custody. Clint didn't turn to look at Rachel, but he could feel her presence at his side, unwavering. She knew as well as he did that this was a pivotal moment. This was the kind of breakthrough they had been working toward for months. No, for years. But even as the room around them filled with voices and flashing cameras, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Later that evening, Clint and Rachel stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the day's events heavy on their shoulders. The victory was monumental, but there was still so much left to do. Langston was in custody, his connections to Allen's operation exposed for the world to see, but Clint knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. "We did it," Rachel said, her voice low but full of relief. "We brought Langston down. Allen's empire is crumbling. This is huge." Clint nodded, but his gaze was distant. "It's a victory, but it's just the first step. There's still too much we don't know about Allen's other connections. And now, we have to be careful. He's not going to go down without a fight. Neither is Langston." Rachel's brow furrowed. "You're worried about retaliation?" Clint looked at her, his eyes dark. "I'm worried about everything. The people in power, the ones Langston protected. They're not just going to let this go. We're in the crosshairs now, Rachel, and there's no turning back." The following days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and press conferences. The world watched as Victor Allen's empire began to unravel at lightning speed. Langston's arrest became a headline in every major news outlet, his connections to Allen's operations plastered across front pages everywhere. The scope of the corruption was staggering, but the more Clint saw of it, the more he realized how deeply embedded these systems of power were. The more he uncovered, the more questions he had. But amidst the media frenzy, Clint couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. The fear that this battle wasn't over. That even though they had won a major victory, the forces they had just exposed would stop at nothing to protect themselves. And Clint knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't just about taking down one criminal. It was about dismantling an entire corrupt system that stretched far beyond what anyone could imagine. The sun had barely begun to rise when Clint Eastwood found himself pacing back and forth in his office. The adrenaline from the previous days had worn off, but the weight of what he had exposed, and what was still left to uncover, hung heavily on his shoulders. The courtroom victory, while monumental, had only been the beginning of what was sure to be a long and dangerous journey. Outside his window, the city stirred to life, the streets already bustling with people. The world had witnessed the collapse of Judge Langston's career, but Clint knew that Victor Allen was far from defeated. The criminal empire that Allen had built was far-reaching and had its claws in places that Clint had only begun to understand. Allen would retaliate. He always did. Clint stopped pacing and took a seat at his desk, his hands folding in front of him as he stared at the papers in front of him. The evidence they had against Langston was solid, but it wasn't enough to bring down Allen. Clint knew that now. Allen's network of contacts and allies were still intact. They were still powerful. And as much as Clint hated to admit it, the truth was that Langston had only been one piece of a much larger puzzle. He heard a soft knock on the door, followed by Rachel's voice. "Clint? We need to talk." Clint looked up, his face tired but resolute. "Come in." Rachel stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She looked as determined as ever, but there was a visible exhaustion in her eyes. The last few days had taken their toll on both of them. "Any updates?" Clint asked, his voice low. Rachel crossed the room and sat across from him. "We've been digging into Allen's connections, but it's like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. He's got people everywhere, lawyers, politicians, even some high-ranking officials. The longer this goes on, the more we're realizing just how deep his influence runs." Clint's jaw tightened. We've taken down Langston, but that's just one piece. Allen won't stop until every part of his empire is intact. Rachel nodded, her eyes narrowing. We've got one advantage, though. Langston's arrest has made the news everywhere. We've already got a lot of public support behind us. People are starting to wake up to what Allen's been doing. The more we expose, the more pressure we can put on him. Clint leaned back in his chair, considering her words. Public opinion was a powerful tool. It could turn the tide in their favor, especially if they could rally enough support. But they needed more than just public outcry. They needed leverage. They needed a way to cripple Allen's operation from the inside. I've been thinking, Clint said slowly, his gaze focused on the papers in front of him. We need to take the fight directly to Allen. We can't wait for him to make the first move. Rachel frowned. What are you suggesting? Clint's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. I'm suggesting that we go after his money, his assets. If we can cripple his financial foundation, we can cripple his entire empire. Without money, Allen loses his power. The idea of attacking Allen's financial empire wasn't new. In fact, it was something they had considered from the start. But now, with Langston's arrest shaking up the system, the timing felt right. The world was watching, and Allen was on the defensive. But Clint knew that going after his financial infrastructure wouldn't be easy. Allen had layers of protection. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and a network of people willing to do whatever it took to keep his wealth hidden. We've got a lot of ground to cover, Rachel said, her voice steady. But if we can get access to Allen's financial records, we can start following the money. Once we have a clear picture of where it's all going, we can begin to pull on the threads. Clint nodded. I know some people who might be able to help with that. We'll need a good team in place. Hackers, financial analysts, anyone who can get past the red tape and find what we need. Rachel stood, determination in her eyes. We'll make it happen. But Clint, there's something else? Clint raised an eyebrow. What is it? I've been getting calls from some of the people who worked with Langston, people who were in the know about his dealings with Allen. They're scared, Clint. They're afraid of what's coming next, and they're starting to talk. We might be able to get more information, but we need to protect them. Clint's gaze softened, but his resolve didn't waver. We'll keep them safe. Get me a list of who they are, and we'll figure out the best way to handle it. Over the next few days, Clint's team worked tirelessly, pulling together the resources they needed to take down Allen's empire from the inside. They assembled a team of cybersecurity experts, financial investigators, and former law enforcement officers, individuals who had the skills and knowledge to go after Allen's hidden assets and uncover the full extent of his criminal network. As they dug deeper, they began to uncover a series of offshore accounts, each linked to a different company, each with layers of false ownership to mask its true purpose. Every discovery was like a piece of a larger puzzle falling into place, but it was slow work. Allen's empire was built on secrecy, and every time they thought they had a breakthrough, they were met with a wall of resistance. Meanwhile, the media frenzy over Langston's arrest had only intensified. News outlets were covering every detail of the case, and the public was beginning to demand more transparency. People were asking questions, and pressure was mounting on authorities to investigate Allen's operations. But Clint knew that the real power lay in the shadows, where Allen's allies lurked, pulling the strings behind the scenes. The more they learned, the clearer it became that they were up against a force far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Allen's influence wasn't just confined to a few corrupt officials. It reached into the highest echelons of society, the kind of people who were used to getting what they wanted, no matter the cost. And they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Clint stood in the window of his office, staring out at the city below. The sun had set, and the lights of the city had started to twinkle in the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something bigger, something more powerful than they had ever imagined. But with each step forward, the danger grew. The stakes were higher than ever. Rachel walked in, a stack of papers in her hands. She looked up at Clint, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "We've got something," she said, her voice steady. Clint turned toward her, his heart quickening. "What is it?" "We traced a series of transactions. Large sums of money, some of it coming from offshore accounts, some from shell companies. But we've also found a direct link between those funds and several politicians in Washington. High-ranking people. People who were supposed to be untouchable. Clint's jaw tightened. This goes higher than we thought. Allen's network is deeper than just a few corrupt judges. He's got people in power. Rachel nodded. And that's not all. We've got evidence that suggests some of these politicians have been involved in laundering money for Allen's operations. It's massive, Clint. Clint took a deep breath, processing the magnitude of what they had just uncovered. This is it. We've got him. But as Clint stood there, staring at the evidence before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just opened a door to something much darker and much more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The days that followed their breakthrough on Allen's financial empire were filled with tension. Clint and his team worked around the clock, connecting the dots between Allen's criminal operations and the high-ranking officials who had aided him. The discovery of a web of political corruption, stretching from Washington to local governments, made Clint realize just how much they were up against. What had initially seemed like a fight against a single criminal organization had now turned into a battle against a corrupt network that threatened to tear apart everything Clint held dear. Despite the increasing danger, Clint's resolve remained unshaken. Every discovery they made pushed him forward. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Victor Allen was the heart of this corruption, and he would do anything to protect it. Now, they had reached a crossroads. To bring down Allen, they needed to get to the root of his empire, his inner circle. But doing so meant infiltrating some of the most dangerous circles of power in the country. It wasn't just about getting Allen's money or exposing his connections. It was about taking down the people who were behind him, pulling the strings in the shadows. Clint met with Rachel in their safe house late one night. The weight of the task ahead hung between them, but there was no turning back now. "We've got a problem," Clint said, his voice low but focused. "We're not just up against Allen anymore. His network is deeply entrenched in the highest levels of government. If we go after them, we risk bringing the whole system down." Rachel looked at him, her expression hardening. "But we can't back down now. We're this close, Clint. If we stop now, all of this, everything we've done, will be for nothing." Clint nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the documents spread out on the table. Each piece of information they had uncovered was a step closer to unraveling Allen's entire operation. But as the pieces fit together, Clint realized that this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a war that could change everything. "We can't take this to the authorities," Clint continued, his mind racing with possibilities. "Not yet. The system is compromised. We need to go directly to Allen's people. Expose them. Get them to turn on him." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You want to go after them, face to face?" Clint leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Yes. We need to make them think we're one of them. If we want to bring this down, we have to get close to the inner circle. I know it's dangerous, but it's the only way." Rachel exhaled sharply, as if trying to prepare herself for the uncertainty of what they were about to do. "And how exactly do you propose we infiltrate one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country?" Clint's lips curled into a slight grin. "We make them an offer they can't refuse." The plan was risky. No, it was beyond risky. It was borderline insane. But Clint had a way of thinking several steps ahead, and right now, this was the only way to get to Victor Allen. If they could gain the trust of Allen's key players, they could gather enough evidence to bring the entire operation down, piece by piece. It wouldn't be easy, but Clint had done impossible things before. This was just another challenge in a long line of them. Over the next few days, Clint's team worked quickly to set the stage for their infiltration. They dug deeper into Allen's operations, tracing connections between his associates and other key players in the political world. They found a number of high-profile individuals who had attended secret meetings, parties, and fundraisers, events that Allen had hosted to solidify his influence. The team created new identities, forged documents, and set up an elaborate cover story to infiltrate these circles. Clint and Rachel would pose as new players in the game, interested in investing in Allen's operations, looking to profit from the chaos that Allen had created. They would use the right contacts, the right stories, and, most importantly, the right amount of charm to earn their place in Allen's inner circle. The plan was to get invited to one of Allen's private events, a gathering of the country's most powerful and influential figures. It was there, in that den of corruption, that Clint and Rachel hoped to gather the final pieces of evidence they needed to bring Allen down. The stakes had never been higher. The night of the event arrived faster than Clint had anticipated. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, his face a picture of calm. Rachel stood next to him, equally poised, but Clint could see the tension in her eyes. They both knew what was on the line. If they slipped up, if they made one wrong move, they could lose everything. "You ready for this?" Clint asked, his voice a mix of determination and a hint of amusement. Rachel smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ready as I'll ever be." The two of them made their way to the event in the heart of the city, a lavish gala held at one of the most exclusive venues in town. The building was a massive, opulent structure, the kind of place where the powerful gathered to make deals, shake hands, and keep their secrets. Clint and Rachel entered the venue as just another couple of wealthy investors, their fake identities perfectly crafted to blend in. They were greeted by the host, a smooth-talking middleman who had connections to everyone. It wasn't long before they were surrounded by people in suits and gowns, all exchanging pleasantries and talking in hushed tones about the future of their investments. But Clint's eyes were scanning the room, searching for the man who had brought them here, the man who would introduce them to Victor Allen's people. And there he was, Victor Allen himself, standing at the center of the room, surrounded by his closest allies, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd with the confidence of a man who had everything. He looked the part of a powerful kingpin, his tailored suit, his sharp features, and his cold, calculating demeanor. Clint knew that this was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. If he could get close enough to Allen, he could finally put an end to this nightmare. But before he could make his move, a voice broke through his thoughts. "I see you made it." Clint turned to see a man approaching him, a tall figure in a dark suit, his face half hidden in shadow. He extended his hand, a knowing smile on his lips. "Mr. Eastwood, I presume?" "I've heard a lot about you," the man said smoothly, shaking Clint's hand. "I'm Tony Moore. I think you and I will get along just fine." Clint shook his hand, giving him a cool smile. "I hope so." Tony's smile widened. "You're in the right place. Let's talk business." As Clint followed Tony deeper into the crowd, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was it, the lion's den, and Clint was about to step right into it. The room was everything Clint had imagined and more. Elegant, excessive, and full of smiles that never quite reached the eyes. Everywhere he looked, he saw faces that would have made any regular person feel small in comparison. The people here weren't just wealthy, they were untouchable. Their power radiated through every gesture, every word. Clint's heart beat steadily as he followed Tony Moore, who had introduced himself as a key player in Allen's network. The man had a reputation for being both charming and ruthless, a perfect blend for someone working at the heart of such a corrupt empire. As Tony led him deeper into the crowd, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. His cover was on the line. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and their entire plan would unravel. Rachel stayed close behind Clint, scanning the room for anything or anyone of interest. They had been briefed on the important figures they needed to approach, but the real challenge was getting close enough to gather useful intel without raising suspicion. There was no room for mistakes here. This was the kind of event where trust was currency, and the price for betrayal was high. "I've got a feeling you're going to like it here, Clint," Tony said, leading them toward a group of men who were speaking in hushed tones. He smiled widely, introducing them with the same smooth confidence. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Mr. Clint Eastwood. He's someone who's been making waves in the business world." The men nodded politely, their eyes lingering just long enough to show they were sizing him up. They didn't seem impressed by his appearance, just the usual pleasantries to keep up appearances. But Clint knew that the game had begun. They were testing him, trying to gauge his worth, his connections, his intentions. He was nothing more than a pawn for now, but he needed to play the role perfectly. "I've heard good things about you, Clint," one of the men said, offering his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes were calculating. "But the real question is, can you deliver?" Clint took the man's hand, smiling just enough to show he was confident without overplaying his hand. I'm always interested in delivering. But the question is, what exactly are we delivering? The man chuckled, a low, amused sound. Fair point. We're all looking for something. But the real question is how far you're willing to go to get it. Clint's eyes flickered, but his expression didn't change. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to get close to Victor Allen's empire, and to survive long enough to bring it down. Tony seemed to pick up on the tension in the air, and quickly steered the conversation elsewhere. But Clint could sense that this was just the beginning. The real challenge was going to be getting Allen's people to trust him enough to open up. The night wore on, and Clint and Rachel worked their way through the event, meeting various key players, exchanging carefully crafted words, and pretending to be just another pair of ambitious investors looking to make a quick profit. But underneath the surface, they were constantly on alert, aware of the dangers that could spring from any conversation. Clint's mind was racing as he tried to keep track of everything he was hearing. The names being thrown around, politicians, business tycoons, influential figures in law enforcement, all of them were connected in some way to Allen's criminal empire. It was like walking through a maze of power and influence, where every step felt precarious. At one point, Clint found himself alone at the bar, nursing a drink, when a man slid into the seat next to him. This one was different, a cold presence, sharp eyes that never blinked, and a posture that screamed authority. "Clint Eastwood, right?" the man asked, his voice deep and clipped. Clint turned to face him, his posture casual but alert. "That's right. And you are?" The man didn't smile, his gaze piercing as he sized Clint up. "I don't usually get involved with people like you, but Tony Moore seems to think you're worth a shot." Clint's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. "I'm just here to make deals. What about you?" The man took a sip from his drink, his eyes never leaving Clint's face. "I handle the more delicate matters. The stuff that can't be seen, can't be traced. People like me keep the world turning. People like you." He looked Clint up and down. "Don't know how the game is really played." Clint smiled, the corners of his mouth curling up just slightly. "Then I suppose I'm here to learn, aren't I?" The man leaned in, his voice low. "You'd better. People like Allen don't take kindly to those who waste his time. Make sure you're worth the investment." Clint's mind was racing as the man stood up and walked away, leaving a chill in the air. That was a warning, a direct challenge. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just part of Allen's empire. He was a gatekeeper, someone Clint would need to win over if he was to get close to the real power. As Clint turned to rejoin Rachel, he caught sight of a familiar figure across the room. Victor Allen. For the first time since stepping into this den of vipers, Clint felt the rush of danger hit him full force. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when everything they had worked for would come to a head. Clint's mind went into overdrive as he scanned the room, trying to assess the best way to approach Allen. But Allen was surrounded by his closest allies, the most dangerous people in the room. It would take more than just a few casual words to get in his circle. It would take strategy. It would take finesse. And it would take guts. Clint took a deep breath, the familiar tension filling his body. He and Rachel had come this far, and now they had to make their move. They had to become part of Allen's world, no matter the cost. As Clint and Rachel prepared to make their next move, Clint couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could they keep up the charade? Every second spent in this room was a gamble. Every conversation was a tightrope walk. One misstep, and they could lose everything. But Clint had always thrived in high-stakes situations. He'd made a career out of it. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. This was more than just a fight for justice. It was a fight for survival. And Clint Eastwood wasn't the type to lose. The night was thick with tension as Clint and Rachel maneuvered through the sea of people in the high-end ballroom. Their faces were calm, masks of controlled confidence, but inside, their minds were racing. The clock was ticking. Victor Allen and his network were within arm's reach, and Clint knew that the next move would determine everything. This wasn't just another case. It was the culmination of months of planning, months of being 2 steps ahead of their enemies. One wrong move, and all would be lost. They had successfully integrated into Allen's world, but now came the most crucial part of their mission, the confrontation. Getting Allen alone, without raising suspicion from his guards or the others who surrounded him, would take precision and finesse. They had to make their move, and fast. As Clint walked past a group of influential businessmen, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Tony Moore standing behind him, his smile sharp, but his eyes cold. "Mr. Eastwood, you're quite the talk of the town tonight," Tony said smoothly, his voice low enough that only Clint could hear. "It seems you're catching the right attention." Clint turned to face him, giving a polite but nonchalant smile. "I try to stay out of the spotlight, but I'm always happy to meet the right people." Tony's eyes gleamed with what seemed like amusement. "I believe you've met most of the right people tonight, but if you're serious about this business, you should meet someone else." Before Clint could respond, Tony waved his hand, signaling for him to follow. Rachel, who had been quietly observing the conversation from the corner of the room, narrowed her eyes. She knew exactly what this meant. Tony was about to lead them to someone deeper in Allen's network, someone with the power to either destroy them or make them indispensable. They moved through the crowd, the sound of clinking glasses and hushed conversations fading into the background. Tony guided them toward a secluded corner where an older man stood alone, staring out a window overlooking the city skyline. "This is Richard Langdon," Tony said, his voice almost reverent. "If you're serious about making an impact in this world, you'll want to get on his good side." Clint sized the man up. Richard Langdon was a well-known figure, not just for his wealth, but for his strategic mind. He was the kind of person who didn't just play the game. He controlled it. A key figure in the political underworld, Langdon was rumored to have the ear of some of the most powerful people in the country. Clint extended his hand, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Langdon. I've heard a lot about you." Langdon gave him a curt nod, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "I'm sure you have," he replied, his voice cool, "but I don't take compliments easily. I'm more interested in what you bring to the table." Clint didn't flinch. This was a test, and he wasn't going to fail it. "I bring more than just money. I bring connections, influence, and a vision for what this country could be if we played our cards right." Langdon raised an eyebrow. "You sound confident, but confidence doesn't mean much unless you can prove it." "Maybe," Clint said, his voice unwavering, "but what I can prove is my loyalty. I can be someone you want on your side." There was a long pause. Langdon studied Clint for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Finally, he stepped back, as if deciding whether Clint was worth the effort. "Loyalty is a rare commodity these days," Langdon said quietly, "but it's something I value. Perhaps we'll see if you're truly loyal, Mr. Eastwood. There's a meeting tomorrow, one that could prove quite lucrative for the right people. Maybe you should attend." Clint nodded, his mind already working. This was it, the break he needed. A meeting. The kind of meeting that could lead him directly to Allen's inner circle. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for, but Clint knew better than to jump in too quickly. "Consider me there," Clint said, giving Langdon a knowing look. "I'll be there." The following day, Clint and Rachel met in their safe house to prepare. The meeting with Langdon would take place in a private estate, secluded and heavily guarded. It would be an invitation-only event, meaning that whoever was present held power, real power. This wasn't just a business transaction. It was a chance to prove they were worth the risk. Rachel leaned over the table, eyes scanning the list of attendees. "This is it, Clint. One wrong word, and we're exposed." "I know," Clint said, his voice steady, "but this is the only way we get close to Allen. Langdon is the gatekeeper. If we gain his trust, we gain access to everyone else." Rachel sighed, frustration creeping into her expression. "But we don't know enough. We don't know who's on that guest list, who's aligned with Allen, who's loyal to Langdon." Clint placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We don't need to know everything right now. We just need to survive the meeting. Play the game, earn their respect. The rest will fall into place." Rachel looked up at him, a faint smile crossing her lips. "I've never seen you so confident." Clint smiled back. "It's not confidence, Rachel. It's focus. Right now, we can't afford anything else." The day of the meeting arrived, and Clint found himself dressed in a sharp suit, walking up the steps of Langdon's private estate. The mansion loomed ahead, guarded and secluded. It was the kind of place where deals were made in secret, where alliances were forged or broken with a single glance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the quiet hum of conversations that were too well rehearsed to sound genuine. The guests, wealthy investors, high-ranking politicians, and power brokers from various industries, stood in tight groups, each group seemingly more powerful than the last. Clint and Rachel were escorted to a secluded room where the meeting would take place. Langdon, ever the enigma, stood at the center, flanked by a few familiar faces, including Tony Moore and several other men Clint recognized from the gala the night before. It was clear this was no casual affair. Langdon's voice cut through the chatter as he addressed the group. "We're here to discuss something much bigger than business. This is about power. And for those of you who understand that, there's room for growth. But understand this. If you show weakness, you'll be discarded." Clint's pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. This was it, the moment he had prepared for. The game had begun in earnest. He knew now that if he could make it through this meeting, he would be one step closer to Allen. But more than that, he knew that Langdon was testing him, and Clint wasn't about to fail. The air in Langdon's private estate had thickened with anticipation, and Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Every word, every glance, every move had to be calculated. The gathering was about more than just business. It was a proving ground, a moment where men with power tested one another's resolve. To survive this room meant to enter a new phase of the game, one where there would be no room for mistakes. As Clint stood there, surrounded by people who seemed to know each other's secrets, he couldn't help but feel the rush of adrenaline. The stakes had been raised. Victor Allen, the man at the heart of everything they were trying to bring down, was within reach, but Clint still needed to navigate this dangerous web of relationships to get to him. His plan was simple: gain Langdon's trust, play the game, and get closer to Allen without tipping his hand. Langdon stood at the front of the room, exuding calm authority, his voice cutting through the chatter as he addressed the group. "This isn't about what you think you can do. It's about what you're willing to do. Power doesn't come from connections alone. It comes from actions, from the choices you make when no one's watching. And right now, you all have a choice. A choice to step forward or fade into the shadows." Clint's eyes narrowed as he took in Langdon's words. Every word seemed calculated to test those around him, to provoke a response. He knew this wasn't just a speech. It was a trap, a carefully laid test of loyalty, resolve, and vision. But Clint had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Tony Moore, standing off to the side, gave Clint a sharp nod, as if signaling that now was the time to speak up. It was the opening Clint had been waiting for, the moment to make his mark, to ensure that Langdon and the rest of the room saw him as someone worth watching. Clint stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room turned toward him. For a brief moment, he allowed the silence to stretch, knowing full well that the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You're right," Clint said, his voice calm but commanding. "Power isn't about connections. It's about what you're willing to do when things get tough. When it's not about who you know, but what you're willing to risk. And I'm willing to risk everything." There was a murmur in the room, but Clint didn't back down. He could see the flicker of interest in Langdon's eyes, the subtle shift in the energy around him. This was the moment to prove himself. He knew the game wasn't about flashy displays of wealth or status. It was about proving that he had the steel to survive this world. Langdon, who had been standing with his arms crossed, now uncrossed them and took a slow step toward Clint. The tension in the room was palpable. Langdon's gaze was piercing, as if he were trying to read Clint's very soul. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Eastwood," Langdon said, his voice low. "But I have to admit, there's something about you that tells me you understand the stakes." Clint met Langdon's gaze without hesitation. "I understand that power is about control. And right now, Langdon, you're holding the cards. But I'm not here to be your pawn. I'm here to be your partner. If you're willing to take the risk." The room fell silent. It was a challenge, but Clint knew he had to go all in. He couldn't afford to back down now. His mind was racing, calculating the risks, thinking 2 steps ahead. Every word, every glance, every move had to be deliberate. He had already decided that there was no turning back. He was going to play this game, and play it to win. Langdon's lips curled into a faint smile, as though he'd been waiting for Clint to make this move all along. "You want to be my partner, Mr. Eastwood?" he asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Then prove it." Clint took a deep breath. "I will. But first, let me show you something." He turned to Rachel, who had been standing quietly by his side, watching the exchange. With a swift motion, he signaled for her to bring the briefcase they had prepared for this exact moment. Rachel's eyes flickered with understanding, and she stepped forward, handing Clint the case. Langdon's eyes followed the case as Clint opened it, revealing a set of documents inside. The room went quiet, the tension thickening once more. Clint had anticipated that Langdon would want something to seal the deal, and this was it. The documents inside the briefcase were more than just pieces of paper. They were the key to everything. "These," Clint began, his voice steady, "are the first step. These are the documents that will allow you to expand your reach into new markets, new territories that could increase your profits tenfold. But the key to making it happen isn't just money. It's information. Information that only someone with the right kind of influence can access." Langdon leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the documents in Clint's hand. "Where did you get this?" Clint allowed himself a small smile. "I have my sources." It was a calculated move, one that played on Langdon's need for control. The documents weren't just business agreements. They were a small piece of the puzzle that would eventually lead Langdon and Allen into Clint's web. They were bait. Langdon took the documents, flipping through them with careful precision. He was silent for a long time, the room holding its breath as he assessed what Clint had just presented him with. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Impressive," Langdon said slowly. "I have to admit, you've got my attention. You understand the game better than most." Clint felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The first part of his plan had worked, but he wasn't done yet. This was the beginning, not the end. "I don't just understand the game," Clint said, his voice low and steady. "I intend to win it." Langdon raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And how do you plan on doing that?" Clint stepped forward, locking eyes with Langdon. "By helping you expand your influence. By taking control of Allen's operations from the inside. You and I both know that Allen is the key to everything. But he's too dangerous to trust. He's too unpredictable. We need someone who can control the situation. Someone who can make sure things go according to plan." Langdon stood silently for a moment, his gaze intense. He didn't speak, but Clint could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. Langdon was evaluating him, testing him, but Clint had already made up his mind. This was the moment where he could tip the scales in their favor. This was his chance to take down Allen and everyone who was working with him. "I can help you with that," Clint said, his voice hard with resolve. "I can give you the leverage you need to control Allen. All I need from you is trust." Langdon stared at him for a long time, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Trust is earned, Mr. Eastwood, but you've made a strong case. I'll give you the chance to prove your worth." Clint nodded back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's all I need." The final gambit had been played. Clint had secured a foothold in Langdon's network, and with it, the first real step toward taking down Victor Allen. But the game was far from over. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, and Clint knew that trust would be the ultimate weapon in the battle that lay ahead. As Clint and Rachel left the estate, the weight of what they had just accomplished settled in. They had made their move, but the real challenge was just beginning. Langdon had taken the bait, but now they had to navigate the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and power plays that would determine who would come out on top. Clint's mind raced with the possibilities. But one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?